Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime Historian. In the long line of Egypt's rulers, most were men who inherited the throne through birthright or conquest. Yet one woman managed to claim the same titles, wear the same crowns, and govern with the same authority. How did that come about in a world where such a thing was almost unheard of? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening tonight, drop a quick comment with your city and the local time where you are right now. I always enjoy seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Around the year 1507 BCE, in the bustling city of Thebes, a daughter was born to Pharaoh Thutmose I and his principal wife, Queen Ahmose. They gave her the name Hatshepsut, meaning foremost of noble women. Thebes served as the main centre of power during the early 18th dynasty, with its massive temple complexes dedicated to Amun rising on the east bank of the Nile, while burial grounds and mortuary temples occupied the quieter west bank. The river flowed steadily past the city, providing water for irrigation canals that fed fields of emmer wheat and barley, and supporting the constant movement of boats carrying grain, stone, and people. The royal palace occupied a prominent spot near the Karnak temple precinct. Its walls, made of mud brick coated with white plaster and painted with scenes of royal life, enclosed wide courtyards, pillared halls, and private apartments. Inside, the air carried the scent of burning myrrh and lotus flowers from offering altars, mixed with the smell of baking bread from kitchens where women shaped loaves and tended clay ovens. Servants in simple linen kilts or dresses moved through the corridors, balancing baskets of figs, dates, onions, and beer jars on their heads. Scribes sat cross-legged in shaded areas, dipping reed pens into ink to record inventories or royal decrees on papyrus rolls. Hatshepsut arrived as the daughter of a king, who had risen through military service rather than direct royal blood on his mother's side. Thutmose I had married Ahmose, who carried prestigious lineage as a descendant of the founders of the dynasty. Ahmose bore the title Great Royal Wife, and came from the family that had driven out the Hyksos invaders decades earlier. This connection strengthened Thutmose I's position and gave his children by Ahmose a special claim to legitimacy. The couple had at least 2 daughters. Hatshepsut appears to have been the elder surviving one. A possible older or younger sister named Neferubuti is mentioned in a few records, but she likely died in childhood, leaving Hatshepsut as the primary daughter from this principal marriage. Thutmose I also had sons by secondary wives, including one named Thutmose who would later take the throne as Thutmose II. These half-brothers shared the palace but belonged to different maternal lines, which sometimes created subtle divisions in court loyalties. Daily life in the palace followed a rhythm tied to the Nile seasons and the religious calendar. Mornings began with priests performing rituals at dawn in the temples, their chants drifting across the walls. The royal family rose to wash with water scented with oils, then dressed in fine linen garments, pleated kilts for men, close-fitting dresses for women, often adorned with broad collars of faience beads or gold. Breakfast might consist of flatbread, cheese, honey, and fruit, eaten while sitting on low stools or mats. As a newborn, Hatshepsut would have been cared for by wet nurses and attendants in the women's quarters, a quieter section of the palace with its own gardens and pools. These nurses, often from noble families themselves, handled feeding, bathing, and early soothing. The baby was wrapped in soft linen, protected from the sun with light canopies, and surrounded by amulets meant to ward off illness. Small figures of Bez, the household protector, or scarabs inscribed with protective spells. The court included a wide circle of officials, viziers who oversaw administration, treasurers managing grain stores and tribute from conquered lands, and military commanders reporting on campaigns in Nubia or the Levant. Thutmose I's reign focused on securing Egypt's borders and expanding influence southward, bringing back captives, cattle, and gold that filled the treasury and supported temple building. This activity meant the palace often hosted returning expeditions, with soldiers displaying ostrich feathers and ebony from distant regions. Queen Ahmose played a visible role in religious ceremonies, appearing alongside her husband to offer to Amun or Hathor. Her position as a link to the dynasty's origins gave her influence in matters of succession and ritual. The royal children grew up observing these events, learning early that power rested not only on military strength, but on maintaining favour with the gods through proper offerings and temple support. Hatshepsut's infancy passed amid this ordered world of duty and display. Servants changed her linens, musicians played harps and sistra during family gatherings, and priests recited protective formulas over her cradle. The palace gardens provided shade from date palms and sycamore figs, where birds fluttered among papyrus plants in artificial pools. Beyond the walls, Thebes hummed with activity marketplaces near the riverfront sold pottery, vegetables, and fish, while craftsmen in workshops shaped stone vessels or wove linen on looms. As she grew into toddlerhood, Hatshepsut would have begun to notice the differences in status around her. Playmates from noble families joined her in the courtyards, supervised by tutors who taught basic manners and stories of the gods. The weight of her father's position became clearer with each public appearance, where crowds gathered to see the king in his regalia, carried on a litter or standing in a chariot. The Nile's annual inundation arrived each summer, turning fields into lakes and bringing rich silt that guaranteed harvests. During this time, palace routines adjusted more offerings to Hapi, the inundation god, and celebrations when the river peaked. Hatshepsut experienced these cycles from within the safety of the royal household, surrounded by people whose lives revolved around keeping the kingdom stable and the king secure. Her mother Ahmose maintained a household staff that included personal attendants, hairdressers who arranged elaborate wigs, and maids who applied kohl to eyes for protection from the sun and flies. The queen's apartments held chests of jewellery, gold bracelets, lapis lazuli beads, and rings set with carnelian items that symbolized status and divine favour. Thutmose I's other children by lesser wives lived in separate quarters but appeared at family events. The half-brothers trained in military skills from an early age, practicing with wooden bows or driving model chariots. This separation of maternal lines was practical, allowing the king to form alliances through multiple marriages while preserving the principal wife's elevated role. In these early years, Hatshepsut's world consisted of familiar faces, routine rituals, and the steady presence of the Nile. The palace functioned as a self-contained community, with its own granaries, bakeries, and breweries producing the daily necessities. Scribes kept detailed records of everything from grain distributions to temple endowments, ensuring the smooth operation of both royal and divine affairs. As the daughter of the reigning pharaoh and his chief wife, Hatshepsut held a privileged place from the start. Her name reflected hopes for nobility and prominence, qualities the family expected her to embody as she grew. Thebes, with its temples echoing hymns and its river carrying news from upstream and downstream, formed the backdrop for her first steps into a life shaped by tradition, duty, and the quiet machinery of power. Princess in the Court Thebes remained the fixed centre of Hatshepsut's early world as she moved from infancy into childhood. The palace compound expanded in her awareness from the women's quarters to wider spaces, open courtyards where sunlight fell on painted floors, colonnaded walkways lined with columns shaped like bundled papyrus stalks, and garden areas planted with sycamore figs, date palms, and beds of lettuce and onions tended by gardeners who watered them from clay pots. By the time she could walk steadily, attendants guided her small steps along shaded paths. Nurses carried her when the sun grew strong, holding linen parasols above her head to shield her skin. She wore simple linen shifts tied at the shoulder, often white or pale yellow, with a small broad collar of blue faience beads resting against her chest. Her hair, still short and curly in childhood, was sometimes covered with a protective cloth or left free to catch the breeze from the river. Daily routines settled into patterns that repeated with the seasons. Mornings started with washing in basins of Nile water scented with lotus oil. Breakfast arrived on low tables, fresh bread baked that morning, soft cheese made from goat milk, honey drizzled over dates, and sometimes slices of watermelon or figs when they were in season. The family ate together when the king's schedule allowed, seated on cushioned stools or mats, while servants stood nearby with fans made of ostrich feathers to keep flies away. Hatshepsut's mother, Queen Ahmose, appeared regularly in her daughter's life. Ahmose managed her own household staff and participated in temple duties at Karnak, where she offered incense and flowers to Amun during certain festivals. When not occupied with ceremonies, she spent time in the palace gardens or private rooms, directing maids in the preparation of linen garments or the arrangement of jewellery boxes filled with gold anklets, earrings, and rings. Hatshepsut observed these activities from nearby, learning early that a queen's role included both public ritual and private management of the household. Her father, Thutmose I, spent much of his time away on military campaigns or inspecting building projects. When he returned to Thebes, the palace filled with activity officials presenting reports, soldiers displaying captured standards, and scribes recording tribute lists. Hatshepsut saw him in formal settings, wearing the blue war crown or the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, his kilt pleated and belted with a lion's tail. At other times he appeared less formally, sitting with advisors in pillared halls while they discussed grain supplies from the delta or the progress of quarry work at Gebel el Silsila. The princess shared the palace with half-siblings from her father's secondary wives. Thutmose II, older than Hatshepsut, trained in the military wing of the palace, practicing archery with lightweight bows and learning chariot handling in open fields near the river. Other brothers and sisters moved through the same courtyards but kept to their own maternal households for meals and lessons. Interactions between the different lines remained polite but distant, shaped by the understanding that the principal wife's children held priority in matters of succession. Common people entered the palace only on specific occasions, craftsmen delivering commissioned items, farmers bringing choice produce as gifts, or petitioners waiting in outer courtyards for an audience. Hatshepsut caught glimpses of these visitors from balconies or through doorways, men in short kilts carrying baskets of vegetables, women with children on their hips offering small jars of oil. The contrast between their simpler clothing and the fine linens of the court became part of her early sense of the world beyond the walls. Religious life wove through every day. Priests from Karnak visited regularly, bringing small statues of gods for household shrines. The family maintained altars in private rooms where daily offerings of bread, beer and flowers were placed before images of Amun, Mut and Khonsu. Hatshepsut learned to place lotus blossoms on offering tables and to repeat short prayers under the guidance of her nurses. During major festivals, such as the Opet celebration, the entire court processed to the temple, with the royal family riding in litters carried by strong bearers. She experienced the crowds lining the route, the sound of sistra and trumpets, and the smell of roasting meat from public feasts. Food in the palace reflected both abundance and regional variety. Nile fish perch, tilapia, catfish arrived fresh each morning, grilled over charcoal or stewed with onions and garlic. Ducks and geese from the marshes provided meat, while cattle slaughtered for special occasions supplied beef. Vegetables included cucumbers, leeks, lentils and radishes, often seasoned with coriander, cumin or salt. Beer, thick and nutritious, was the standard drink for adults and older children, while younger ones drank milk or watered wine. Clothing changed with age and occasion. As Hatshepsut grew, her dresses lengthened and gained pleats along the sides. Servants oiled her skin daily to keep it soft in the dry climate, and applied kohl around her eyes to reduce glare. Wigs were not yet part of her daily wear, but she saw older women and men wearing them elaborate curled or straight styles held in place with beeswax or resin. Play occupied parts of the day. In the gardens she chased wooden balls or pulled small toy boats along miniature canals. Attendants supervised games with other noble children, teaching rules of courtesy while allowing running and laughter within limits. Wooden dolls with movable limbs, carved animals, and spinning tops provided amusement, stored in woven baskets when not in use. The Nile shaped the rhythm of life more than any other force. Each year the inundation arrived, turning low-lying fields into a vast lake and depositing black silt that made the next harvest possible. During the flood season, palace routines shifted more time indoors, increased offerings to Hapi, and stories told about the river god's generosity. When the waters receded, planting began, and the air filled with the scent of turned earth. Hatshepsut watched boats sail past carrying workers to the fields, their sails catching the north wind. Court life included education in manners and basic knowledge, even before formal lessons started. Tutors introduced her to the names of gods, the geography of Egypt's nomes, and simple counting using fingers or pebbles. She learned to recognize symbols carved on temple walls, cartouches with royal names, images of the king smiting enemies, scenes of offering to the gods. These early exposures planted the idea that writing and images carried power beyond everyday speech. Family gatherings occurred during meals or festivals. Thutmose sometimes told stories of his campaigns crossing deserts to reach Nubian gold mines, negotiating with chiefs in the Levant, or supervising the cutting of obelisks at Aswan. Hatshepsut listened quietly, absorbing details of distant lands and the effort required to maintain Egypt's borders and wealth. The palace staff formed a constant background. Cooks worked in open kitchens, pounding grain with mortars, kneading dough, and tending fires. Launderers washed linens in the river, beating them against stones and spreading them to dry on reeds. Gardeners pruned trees and harvested herbs, while doorkeepers controlled access to inner areas. All moved with practiced efficiency, aware that any disruption could reflect poorly on the household. As Hatshepsut approached the age for more structured learning, her days began to include short sessions with scribes or priests. She practiced holding a reed pen, dipping it in red or black ink, and making basic signs on ostraca pottery shards used for practice. These early attempts at writing introduced her to the discipline required for later studies. The weight of her position emerged gradually. Servants bowed when she passed, officials addressed her with titles, and her name appeared in occasional temple inscriptions alongside her parents. She understood that her future depended on the family's stability and her father's success in war and building. Thebes, with its temples, river and palace, remained the entire known world for these childhood years, a place of order, ritual, and quiet expectation. Education of a princess's Hatshepsut. Past her 7th year, the palace routines shifted to include regular hours set aside for formal instruction. A dedicated suite of rooms on the quieter side of the compound became her classroom space, with low tables, reed mats, and shelves holding baskets of ostraca, fresh papyrus rolls, and pallets of red and black ink. The air there carried the faint smell of gum arabic used to bind the pigments, and the sound of reed pens scratching against pottery shards replaced the earlier laughter of garden games. Her primary tutor was a senior scribe named Senenmut, though at this early stage he served only as one of several teachers assigned by the royal household. He arrived each morning after the first temple rituals, carrying his own writing kit in a wooden box. Lessons began, with copying simple signs, the basic uniliteral hieroglyphs that formed the foundation of the script. Hatshepsut sat cross-legged on a mat, steadying her hand as she traced the owl for M, the reed leaf for I, and the loaf for T. Mistakes were wiped away with a damp cloth, and the tutor demonstrated proper grip and pressure to produce clean, even strokes. Progress moved from individual signs to short groups of words. She practiced royal titles, first Pharaoh, great royal wife, king's daughter, because these appeared constantly in temple inscriptions she saw during family visits to Karnak. The tutor explained how the script could be written from left to right to left, or top to bottom, depending on the space available on a wall or statue base. Hatshepsut found satisfaction in the orderliness of it, the way each sign occupied its precise place without crowding. Religious instruction formed a separate but overlapping part of her training. Priests from the Karnak temple rotated through the palace on a weekly schedule. One, a lector priest named Uzahat, taught her the proper sequence of daily offerings. She learned to hold the incense burner with both hands at the correct height, to pour libations of water and wine without spilling, and to recite short formulas invoking Amun as the hidden one who sustained the two lands. These sessions took place in the family shrine room, where small statues of the gods stood on polished stone altars. Hatshepsut practiced until the movements felt natural, understanding that accuracy and ritual maintained the balance between gods and people. Governance lessons came through observation rather than direct teaching at first. Twice each week, she sat quietly in the back of the audience hall, while her father or his vizier received reports. She watched the vizier unroll papyrus scrolls listing grain deliveries from the delta, numbers of cattle from Nubian tribute, and tallies of workers assigned to quarry expeditions. The officials spoke of gnomes, irrigation canals, and the need to store surplus against low inundations. Hatshepsut absorbed the realization that ruling required constant attention to these numbers, that a single poor harvest could affect the entire kingdom's stability. Her mother, Queen Ahmose, occasionally joined these observation sessions and later explained details in private. Ahmose described how taxes were collected in kind, grain measured in bushels, linen counted in bolts, copper weighed in deben, and how the treasury officials tracked every item. Hatshepsut began to see her own future role as connected to these systems, not merely as a participant in ceremonies, but as someone expected to understand the machinery that kept Egypt functioning. Stories of royal ancestors occupied evening hours before the lamps were dimmed. A storyteller attached to the women's quarters recounted the deeds of Ahmose I and Ahmose Nefertari. Hatshepsut heard how her great-grandfather had driven the Hyksos out of the delta after years of conflict, how he had rebuilt temples destroyed during foreign occupation, and how his queen had held the kingdom together during his absences. These tales were delivered in a steady, factual tone, with emphasis on dates of reigns and locations of battles rather than heroic exaggeration. Hatshepsut listened while servants prepared her sleeping mat, picturing the northern cities she had never seen, and the ships that had carried Egyptian soldiers into the delta marshes. The half-brothers received parallel but distinct training. Thutmose II and the other sons spent mornings in the military courtyard learning to string bows, cast throwing sticks at targets, and drive light chariots pulled by trained horses. Hatshepsut glimpsed these sessions from a distance, noting the dust raised by hooves and the instructor's corrections on posture. The contrast between her indoor studies and their outdoor practice highlighted the different expectations placed on royal sons and daughters, yet she noticed that both paths served the same goal of strengthening the dynasty. Daily habits adjusted around the new schedule. Lessons occupied the cooler morning hours, followed by a midday meal of bread, lentils, and grilled fish eaten in the shade of a colonnade. Afternoons included physical activity, walking circuits of the palace gardens, or practicing dance steps used in temple processions. Servants oiled her limbs after exercise and changed her linen dress, which now reached below the knee and featured finer pleating. She began wearing a small wig on formal occasions, a child-sized version with short, straight locks held by a simple fillet. The palace library, a long room lined with wooden chests, became a regular destination. There she handled copies of the Book of the Dead spells, though only the protective sections suitable for a child. She traced the outlines of illustrated scenes showing the journey through the underworld, learning the names of the gates and the guardians. These hours fostered a quiet curiosity about what lay beyond visible life, though the teachings framed it as orderly continuation rather than mystery. Court ambitions revealed themselves through overheard conversations among officials. Thutmose I's plans for new obelisks at Karnak and expansions at the Temple of Mut were discussed openly in her presence. She understood that these projects required stone from Aswan quarries, skilled masons from Memphis, and gold leaf imported through trade routes. The king's drive to leave lasting monuments shaped the atmosphere around him, Advisors competed to suggest grander designs, while treasurers calculated the cost in labour and resources. Hatshepsut developed a habit of reviewing her daily lessons each evening. She would sit with a small lamp, practicing signs on a fresh ostracon until her hand grew steady. This private repetition built confidence and a sense of personal order amid the larger palace routines. She rarely expressed frustration when a sign came out crooked. Instead, she smoothed the surface and tried again, learning persistence as a necessary trait for someone of her station. Interactions with other royal children remained limited, but instructive. During shared festival meals, she observed how her half-brothers carried themselves with the assurance of future military leaders. The girls from secondary wives played quieter games, their futures likely tied to marriage alliances rather than direct rule. These differences were accepted without comment, part of the natural order of the court. Broader political forces pressed in through news arriving by riverboat. Reports of successful campaigns in Nubia brought additional gold and captives, which funded more temple construction. Hatshepsut heard officials praise the king's expansion of Egyptian control southward, securing trade in ivory, ebony, and incense. She connected these victories to the stability that allowed her own education to proceed uninterrupted. Religious rites deepened as she participated more actively. During the annual Beautiful Festival of the Valley, she joined the procession carrying a small sistrum, shaking it in rhythm with the priest's chants. The sound of the instrument, the smell of burning incense, and the sight of the sacred bark carrying Amun's statue across the Nile combined into a powerful sense of continuity with past generations. By her 10th year, Hatshepsut could read short temple inscriptions aloud and calculate basic grain allocations using a system of unit fractions. Her tutors noted her quick grasp of administrative concepts, though they recorded this privately rather than praising her directly. The royal household valued competence without drawing attention to any single child's abilities, preserving balance among the siblings. The king's health and energy remained strong during these years, yet the court quietly prepared for possible transitions. Hatshepsut sensed this preparation in the increased attention given to all royal children's training. She continued her studies with steady application, absorbing the knowledge that one day she might need to advise or support whichever brother inherited the throne. The Nile's cycles continued to frame everything. During the inundation months, lessons moved to upper rooms away from dampness, and stories turned to the agricultural bounty that followed the flood. Hatshepsut watched scribes update flood height records on the Nilometer at Karnak, understanding that accurate measurement directly affected tax assessments and temple offerings. Her inner world remained largely private. She developed a preference for the quiet of the library over noisier garden activities, though she still enjoyed the scent of blooming lotus in the pools. Ambition, if it existed yet, took the form of a growing desire to master the skills expected of her, rather than any outward push for prominence. Fears centered on practical matters, making an error in ritual or failing to remember a sequence of signs rather than larger uncertainties. The royal household's habits reflected the king's focus on empire. Evenings often included discussions of border fortifications or plans for new canals in the Fayum. Hatshepsut listened from her place at the lower end of the table, piecing together how military success, religious piety, and administrative efficiency all supported one another. By the close of this educational period, around age 12, Hatshepsut had acquired the foundational tools of literacy, ritual precision, and basic governance. The palace had become not only home, but a living classroom where every official, priest, and servant contributed to shaping the next generation of rulers. Thebes, its temples growing taller under her father's projects, continued to serve as the unchanging backdrop for her development. Under Father Thutmose, Hatshepsut reached her teenage years while her father's reign moved into its most active phase of expansion. The palace in Thebes received regular reports from the frontiers, delivered by fast riverboats that tied up at the stone quays near Karnak. Messengers in dust-covered kilts unrolled papyrus dispatches in the audience hall, listing the results of Thutmose I's latest campaign. In 1 year, the king led forces deep into Nubia, pushing beyond the Fourth Cataract where previous pharaohs had stopped. His army captured villages, seized herds of long-horned cattle, and brought back sacks of gold dust weighed out in the royal treasury. Hatshepsut stood quietly at the side of the hall during these presentations, watching the vizier mark each entry on his master list while servants carried sample ingots forward for inspection. The expansion brought immediate changes to daily life inside the palace walls. New captives from the south arrived to work in the gardens and workshops, their different accents mixing with the familiar Egyptian speech of the household staff. Some of these men and women were assigned to the women's quarters, where they taught the princess the proper way to prepare Nubian-style millet porridge or to weave tougher fibres into ropes for ship rigging. Hatshepsut noted how their presence added new efficiency to tasks that had previously taken longer. The kitchens began serving larger quantities of meat because the tribute cattle supplied fresh beef several times each week instead of only on festival days. Thutmose I returned from Nubia in a procession that filled the streets of Thebes. Soldiers marched in ranks carrying ostrich feather fans and captured standards, while captured chiefs walked behind them in simple loincloths, their arms bound lightly for show. The king rode in his chariot, wearing the blue war crown and holding a bow across his lap. Hatshepsut watched from a palace balcony as the line passed beneath her, the sound of trumpets and drums echoing off the white-plastered walls. That evening, the family ate together in the main hall, and for the first time she heard her father describe the campaign in his own words not as a story for children but as a factual account of logistics, river navigation, and the decision to leave a garrison at a new fortress. The following year, the king turned his attention northward toward the Levant. Reports arrived of successful crossings of the Sinai Desert and victories over city-states that had resisted Egyptian influence. Tribute ships docked at the northern harbours and then sailed upstream to Thebes loaded with cedar logs from Byblos, jars of olive oil, and bronze weapons. Carpenters in the palace workshops immediately began using the cedar to build stronger doors and furniture for the royal apartments. Hatshepsut visited these workshops with her mother, running her hand over the smooth new wood and learning how the resin scent differed from local acacia. The influx of materials allowed the king to accelerate his building program at Karnak, where new pylons and columned halls rose under teams of masons brought from Memphis. Court officials responded to each success by adjusting their own routines. The treasurer increased the number of scribes assigned to record incoming goods, and the granaries expanded their storage capacity to hold extra grain sent as tax from newly secured provinces. Hatshepsut noticed that meals now included more imported items, small bowls of raisins and almonds from the Levant, or jars of thick honey labelled with the names of conquered towns. Servants replaced worn linen hangings in the private rooms with finer cloth dyed in deeper shades of blue and red, colours that came from trade routes opened by the northern campaigns. The political atmosphere inside the palace grew more focused on maintaining the new territories. Advisors gathered each morning to review border reports, discussing the placement of Egyptian officials in Nubian forts and the need to keep local princes loyal through regular gifts of gold and linen. Hatshepsut listened while pretending to study her own papyrus roll nearby. She began to understand that the king's power rested not only on military force but on the steady flow of resources that kept the temples supplied and the people fed. A single delay in tribute could weaken the entire system. Her mother, Queen Ahmose, took on additional duties during these years. She presided over ceremonies thanking Amun for the victories, offering large bouquets of flowers and reciting lists of conquered places in a clear, steady voice. Hatshepsut stood beside her during these rites, holding a small sistrum and shaking it at the correct moments. Afterward they walked back to the palace together along the processional way, and Amasi explained how the offerings ensured continued divine support for the army. The Queen's role made clear that royal women carried real responsibility in the religious side of governance, even if they did not lead troops. Hatshepsut's half-brother, Thutmose II, accompanied their father on the later campaigns, gaining experience in chariot command and supply management. When the brothers returned, they brought personal accounts of river crossings and desert marches that differed from the official reports. Hatshepsut heard these stories during family suppers and noticed the practical details. Her brother mentioned how soldiers repaired chariot wheels with spare spokes carried on pack donkeys, or how water skins were refilled at specific oases. These conversations showed her the difference between the grand public version of events and the day-to-day realities faced by those who carried them out. The weight of royal duty settled more heavily on her during this period. She began to keep a small personal record on Ostraka of the tribute items she saw arriving, practicing her writing by noting quantities and origins. The exercise helped her organize her thoughts, and she found satisfaction in seeing patterns emerge: gold from Nubia, funding stone from Aswan, cedar from the north strengthening temple doors. Her tutors approved of this habit, but reminded her that such records belonged to the official scribes. She continued anyway in private moments. Daily life adjusted to the new prosperity. Gardeners planted additional beds of exotic flowers brought back from the campaigns, creating shaded walks where the scent of frankincense lingered in the evenings. Musicians added new instruments to their ensemble's lyres with cedar sound boxes and played longer sets during meals. Hatshepsut practiced her own musical training by learning the finger positions for these foreign tunes, though she preferred the traditional Egyptian harp for its deeper tone. Officials from distant provinces began appearing more frequently at court, presenting gifts and swearing loyalty oaths. Hatshepsut observed how her father received them with formal courtesy, offering them seats and listening to their requests for Egyptian engineers to build local irrigation channels. She realized that maintaining the empire required constant negotiation and the exchange of favors, not simply conquest. The king's building projects at Karnak reached a new stage with the erection of a pair of granite obelisks. Hatshepsut visited the temple site with her father one morning, when the work crews had cleared the area. She watched the massive stones being levered into position on their bases, the air filled with the sound of wooden mallets and the shouts of foremen. Thutmose explained the inscriptions planned for their sides, his names and titles, alongside scenes of offering to Amun. The visit left her with a clear picture of how military success translated directly into stone that would stand for centuries. Religious festivals grew larger during these years of expansion. The Opet festival now included additional barges carrying statues from other temples, and the public feasts fed more people because of the extra grain in storage. Hatshepsut participated in the processions, wearing a pleated linen dress and a broad collar of new gold beads received as part of the tribute. She felt the eyes of the crowd on the royal family and understood that her presence helped reassure the people that the gods approved of the king's actions. Her inner sense of responsibility developed quietly. She worried less about personal mistakes in ritual and more about whether the kingdom's growing borders could be held without draining resources from the heartland. She kept these thoughts to herself, discussing them only in short exchanges with her mother during private walks in the garden. Ahmose listened and reminded her that every generation faced similar challenges, and the key was steady administration rather than dramatic gestures. The palace staff expanded to manage the increased workload. New scribes trained in the outer courtyards, their pens moving steadily across practice ostraca. Cooks learned to prepare Levantine dishes requested by visiting dignitaries, and tailors produced more elaborate kilts for the king's military appearances. Hatshepsut watched these changes with interest, noting how each department adjusted its routines to support the wider empire. By the later years of Thutmose I's reign, Hatshepsut had absorbed the practical realities of rule. She understood that campaigns brought wealth but also required careful management to prevent waste. She saw how her father balanced military ambition with temple building, and how both served to strengthen the dynasty's claim to divine favour. The political atmosphere in Thebes had become one of confident expansion, yet she sensed the underlying need for vigilance that kept the entire system functioning. The Nile continued its unchanging cycle, but now the boats arriving during the sailing season carried not only local produce, but goods from across the known world. Hatshepsut walked the riverbank, sometimes with attendants, observing the unloading and feeling the steady pulse of a kingdom that stretched farther than ever before. Her teenage years under her father taught her that royal duty meant paying attention to every detail, from the weight of gold ingots to the precise wording of temple inscriptions, and that the stability of Egypt depended on those who noticed such things. Marriage to Thutmose. Hatshepsut entered her mid-teens as the political landscape within the palace began to shift toward preparations for the next generation. Thutmose I, now in the later years of his reign, turned increasing attention to securing the line of succession. The decision settled on his son, Thutmose II, born to a secondary wife named Mutnefret, as the designated heir. To strengthen the claim and maintain the principal royal bloodline, the king arranged for Hatshepsut to become the wife of her half-brother. This union followed established custom among Egyptian royals, where siblings or half-siblings married to concentrate divine authority within the family. The marriage took place in a series of private ceremonies inside the palace, away from the larger public festivals. Priests from Karnak officiated, burning incense and reciting formulas that linked the couple to the gods Horus and Hathor. Hatshepsut wore a long, pleated dress of the finest translucent linen, gathered at the waist with a broad sash, and a heavy broad collar of gold and lapis lazuli beads that rested across her shoulders. Her hair was arranged in a formal wig of tight curls, held by a thin gold diadem. Thutmose II appeared in a short kilt with a bull's tail attached at the back, his chest bare except for a pectoral ornament showing the king as a sphinx. The couple exchanged simple vows of mutual support before the family altar, then received blessings from their father and mother. After the rite, Hatshepsut moved into new apartments within the palace compound, closer to the main audience halls. These rooms included a private reception area, sleeping chamber with a raised bed platform covered in linen sheets, and a small garden courtyard planted with pomegranate trees and climbing vines. Servants assigned to her household increased in number, maids for dressing and jewellery, a personal scribe to handle correspondence, and a steward to manage supplies of oil, grain, and cloth delivered from the royal stores. Her daily routine adjusted to include more time in these quarters, though she continued to attend family meals and temple visits with her parents. As great royal wife, Hatshepsut assumed responsibilities that extended beyond personal life. She joined Thutmose II in certain official appearances, standing beside him during audiences where officials presented reports or foreign envoys offered gifts. She learned to sit on a slightly lower throne than the king's, holding a fly whisk or small sistrum, and to nod acknowledgement when petitioners addressed the couple together. These sessions taught her the practical side of court protocol, how long to let an official speak, when to signal for a scribe to record a decision, and how to maintain a calm expression regardless of the news being delivered. The couple's relationship developed within the framework of duty rather than personal choice. Thutmose II spent much of his time training with military instructors or reviewing border dispatches with his father's advisors. Hatshepsut saw him at breakfast and evening meals, where they discussed the day's events in measured terms. He described progress on chariot repairs or the arrival of new horses from the Levant, while she shared observations from temple ceremonies or updates on grain inventories. Conversation stayed practical, focused on the smooth operation of the palace and kingdom. Hatshepsut's mother, Queen Ahmose, remained a steady presence during this transition. Ahmose guided her daughter in managing the expanded household staff, explaining how to check the daily delivery lists for quality and quantity, and how to allocate resources fairly among the servants. The two women walked together in the garden most afternoons, reviewing the proper way to receive noble visitors or to prepare offerings for private household shrines. Ahmose emphasized consistency in these tasks, pointing out that small oversights could grow into larger problems if left unchecked. The palace adjusted to the new arrangement without major disruption. Thutmose II's mother, Mutnefret, continued to live in her own set of apartments and appeared at family gatherings, though her role remained secondary to Ahmose's. Other royal wives and children kept to their established routines, with occasional joint appearances at festivals reinforcing the united front of the dynasty. Hatshepsut noticed subtle changes in how officials addressed her titles now included Great Royal Wife alongside King's Daughter, signalling her elevated position. Daily life in the new apartments followed a steady rhythm. Mornings began with washing and dressing, servants bringing warm water scented with myrrh and fresh linen garments. Breakfast arrived on trays bread, figs, honey, and sometimes eggs from the palace poultry yards. After the meal, Hatshepsut met with her steward to review household accounts, or with her scribe to dictate letters confirming receipt of tribute items. Afternoons often included visits to the women's quarters where younger royal relatives lived, or short walks to observe work in the palace workshops. Clothing reflected her new status. Dresses became more elaborate, with additional pleating and borders embroidered in gold thread. She wore heavier jewellery on formal occasions, wide cuffs of gold, anklets that chimed softly when she walked, and earrings of turquoise and carnelian. Servants applied makeup with care, outlining her eyes in kohl and reddening her lips with ochre. These preparations took longer than in her childhood, but became part of the routine that marked her as queen rather than princess. Food in the household remained similar to the main palace fare, but included small personal touches. Hatshepsut requested favourite dishes from her earlier years: stewed duck with leeks, or barley porridge sweetened with dates, and the cooks prepared them regularly. Beer and wine appeared at meals, poured into cups of blue faience or polished stone. During private evenings, she sometimes shared a jar of date wine with Thutmose II while discussing plans for upcoming festivals. Religious duties increased with her marriage. She participated more actively in offerings at Karnak, standing beside Thutmose II to present bouquets or pour libations. Priests taught her additional hymns, specific to her role as consort, emphasizing her connection to Hathor as the goddess who supported the king. These rites reinforced the idea that the royal couple together maintained Ma'at, the cosmic order, through correct action. The couple's first child arrived after several years of marriage. A daughter was born and named Neferua, meaning beauty of Re. The birth took place in the palace with midwives and physicians in attendance, followed by a period of quiet recovery for Hatshepsut. Servants brought the infant to her wrapped in fine linen, and she held the baby in the shaded courtyard while nurses prepared a small cradle of woven reeds padded with soft cloth. Neferua became the centre of the household routine: daily baths in milk and oil, feedings by wet nurses selected from noble families, and protective amulets placed around the cradle. Hatshepsut devoted time each day to her daughter, supervising the nurses and watching the baby's early development. She noticed how the child's eyes followed moving objects and how small hands grasped fingers offered to her. The presence of Neferua added a new layer to palace life, with more visitors bringing small gifts, tiny gold bracelets, carved ivory rattles, or strings of faience beads meant for later wear. Thutmose II's position strengthened as crown prince. He began to appear more often in his father's place at minor ceremonies or when Thutmose I travelled to inspect building sites. Hatshepsut accompanied him on some of these outings, riding in a separate litter or chariot, observing how local officials greeted the heir and presented reports on crop yields or canal maintenance. These trips gave her direct experience of Egypt beyond Thebes. The flat fields of the delta, the rocky paths near Aswan quarries, and the bustling harbours where ships unloaded cedar and copper. Court dynamics shifted gradually. Advisors who had served Thutmose, I began directing more of their reports to the young couple, testing their judgment on minor matters. Hatshepsut learned to ask clarifying questions about numbers or timelines, and to suggest small adjustments when she saw inefficiencies. Thutmose II handled military-related issues, while she focused on administrative and religious details, creating a division of attention that supported the overall stability. The palace gardens expanded during these years, with new plantings of myrrh bushes brought from southern trade routes. Hatshepsut walked there with Neferua carried by a nurse, pointing out the different leaves and explaining their uses in incense or medicine. The quiet paths provided a break from the constant activity of the main halls. As Thutmose I's health began to show signs of age, slower movements, more time spent resting, the court prepared for transition. Hatshepsut sensed the change in the increased frequency of family councils and the careful wording of official announcements. She continued her duties with steady attention, balancing care for her daughter, management of her household, and support for her husband as he stepped closer to the throne. The Nile's annual flood arrived each year with the same reliability, bringing silt and renewal. During the inundation season, palace routines slowed slightly, allowing more time for family and reflection. Hatshepsut used these quieter months to review household records and plan for the coming year's festivals. The marriage had placed her firmly in the centre of power, where every decision carried weight for the dynasty and the kingdom. Life as great royal wife. With the marriage now part of the established order, and Neferu growing from infant to toddler, Hatshepsut's role as great royal wife expanded into steady management of both household and broader estates that supported the royal line. Mornings in her apartments began with a review of estate reports delivered by her steward on papyrus rolls. She examined tallies of grain harvested from fields granted to her near the Fayum, quantities of flax spun into linen in workshops at the palace edge, and numbers of cattle moved between grazing lands to maintain healthy herds. These checks took place while she sat at a low table, reed pen in hand, marking adjustments for any discrepancies before the scribe copied them into official ledgers. The process ensured that her personal resources contributed reliably to palace supplies without drawing from the main treasury. After the estate review, she spent time with Neferu in the shaded courtyard attached to her quarters. The little girl, now walking confidently, played with small wooden animals and cloth dolls under the supervision of two dedicated nurses. Hatshepsut watched her daughter practice stacking painted blocks or splashing in a shallow basin of warm water scented with lotus. She showed Neferu how to identify simple shapes on amulets, the ankh for life, the scarab for renewal, explaining their meanings in short, repeated phrases that the child could mimic. These sessions lasted until midday, when the nurses took Neferu for a nap in a cool inner room lined with reed mats and light hangings to block the sun. Midday meals shifted to a larger hall, where Hatshepsut hosted selected noble families. Officials' wives and daughters arrived in their best linen dresses, bringing small gifts such as jars of perfumed oil or baskets of fresh pomegranates. Conversation turned to practical matters, the progress of irrigation canals on their own lands, the availability of skilled weavers for household staff, or the scheduling of upcoming temple festivals. Hatshepsut listened carefully, offering quiet suggestions about coordinating labour between estates or sharing surplus produce during lean months. These gatherings allowed her to build quiet alliances, learning which families could be relied on for steady support and which needed closer attention to prevent small grievances from growing. Afternoons often included oversight of temple-related duties tied to her position. She visited smaller shrines within the Karnak complex, checking that offerings of bread and beer arrived on time and that priests maintained the correct sequence of daily rites. On these walks she carried Neferu a part of the way, letting the child touch the carved reliefs on column bases while servants held parasols overhead. Back in the palace, she met with the overseer of her wardrobe to inspect new garments woven from estate flax, ensuring the pleats were even and the borders properly dyed. Jewellery chests received similar attention, with pieces sorted by occasion and any missing items noted for replacement from the royal goldsmiths. Family circles within the palace required ongoing navigation. Thutmose II's mother, Mutnefret, maintained her own household in a separate wing and appeared at shared family meals or minor ceremonies. Hatshepsut made a point of including her in decisions about Neferu's care, such as selecting additional nurses or planning the child's first formal presentation at a festival. These gestures kept relations smooth, avoiding any appearance of exclusion that could ripple through the wider court. Other royal relatives from secondary lines joined occasional suppers, where discussions stayed on neutral topics like the quality of recent Nile floods or the arrival of new horses for the stables. Hatshepsut observed the subtle shifts in conversation when certain officials were present, noting who spoke with confidence and who deferred to others. Her growing influence showed in the increasing number of petitions directed to her apartments. Nobles sent requests for her support in temple appointments or for recommendations on grain distribution during dry periods. She reviewed each one with her scribe, approving some and declining others with brief written explanations that the steward delivered. This steady stream of matters gave her a clearer view of conditions across the nomes, from crop reports in the delta to labour needs at quarry sites near Aswan. She developed a habit of keeping personal ostraca notes on recurring issues, filing them in a wooden box for later reference. Personal habits formed around this routine. In the evenings, after Neferua had been settled for the night, Hatshepsut sometimes walked the palace gardens alone with a single attendant carrying a small lamp. She checked the condition of the myrrh bushes and date palms, noting which plants needed extra water or pruning. These quiet moments allowed her to reflect on the balance between her duties and the kingdom's needs. She worried occasionally about the aging king's health and how smoothly the transition to Thutmose II would proceed, but she kept such concerns private, discussing them only in short exchanges with her mother during their weekly garden walks. Clothing and appearance followed patterns suited to her status. She wore pleated linen dresses with wide sashes during the day, changing to lighter shifts for private hours. Servants applied coal and oil each morning, and she selected jewellery from her growing collection: gold bracelets for formal meetings, simpler faience pieces for estate reviews. Meals reflected the variety of her estates: grilled perch from river fisheries, lentil stew seasoned with herbs from the palace gardens, and occasional treats of imported almonds or raisins shared with Neferua. Court nobles responded to her steady approach by seeking her advice more openly on matters outside direct royal command. A vizier's wife might ask about managing household scribes, or a treasurer's daughter about suitable matches for younger siblings. Hatshepsut answered factually, drawing on her own observations without overstepping. This quiet network of connections strengthened her position without drawing attention from the main line of authority. Religious participation deepened through regular involvement in smaller festivals at Mut's temple, where she offered flowers and recited standard hymns alongside other royal women. These events reinforced the queen's role in maintaining divine favour for the family, and she ensured Neferua witnessed portions of them from a safe distance so the child could absorb the rhythms early. The Nile cycles continued to shape the pace of life. During the inundation, estate reports focused on flood levels and potential damage to canals, prompting Hatshepsut to adjust labour assignments from her lands. In the planting season, she reviewed seed distribution lists to guarantee even coverage across her fields. These seasonal adjustments kept her estates productive and contributed to overall stability. Her concerns remained practical, ensuring Neferua received consistent care, maintaining smooth relations with Mutnofret's circle, and keeping estate records accurate so no resources went to waste. She found satisfaction in the order she helped create, from balanced ledgers to well-tended gardens and a growing child who recognized basic hieroglyphs. The palace functioned as an extended household under her attention, with each department operating in coordination with the others. Noble families from outside Thebes began sending representatives more frequently, bringing news of local conditions and small tribute items from their districts. Hatshepsut received them in her reception room, listening to accounts of canal repairs or temple restorations in distant nomes. She noted patterns regions with reliable water sources versus those needing royal engineers and passed relevant details to Thutmose II for consideration in larger planning sessions. Daily routines extended into the evening, with a light supper shared with her husband when his schedule allowed. They reviewed the day's reports together, he on military readiness and she on administrative and estate matters. These exchanges built a shared understanding without formal councils. Afterward, Hatshepsut returned to her apartments to check on Neferua one last time, adjusting a blanket or listening to the child's steady breathing before retiring. The years as great royal wife solidified her place in the palace structure. She managed people and resources with quiet competence, raised her daughter within the expectations of royal life, and cultivated relationships that supported the dynasty's continuity. Personal concerns about future transitions stayed measured, channeled into careful oversight rather than open worry. The court moved forward in its established patterns, with Hatshepsut's steady hand contributing to the smooth operation of everything from morning estate reviews to evening family gatherings. Tuzu reign, and passing Thutmose I's final months brought a noticeable slowing to palace routines that had run with steady energy during the expansion years. The king limited his public appearances to essential temple ceremonies, leaving longer administrative sessions to his son and heir. Hatshepsut continued her estate reviews and household management while spending additional time with her mother Ahmose in the women's quarters, where they coordinated adjustments to the daily schedule of offerings and staff assignments. Physicians visited the king's apartments regularly, preparing mixtures of herbs and honey to support breathing and circulation, but the royal household maintained its outward composure without altering the core flow of reports or deliveries. The king's death came quietly in the palace, around 1493 BCE. Embalmers arrived from their dedicated workshops on the West Bank to begin the 70-day process of preserving the body with natron salts and resins. The palace entered a period of formal mourning, with servants replacing colourful wall hangings with plain linen and reducing the number of lamps lit after sunset. Hatshepsut participated in the initial private rites, alongside her husband Thutmose II, her mother, and other family members, placing small offerings of bread and beer at the household altar, while priests recited standard protective formulas. The court officials gathered in the audience hall to swear continued loyalty to the new king, and messengers carried the announcement upstream and downstream, along the Nile, so that governors in distant nomes could organise local observances. Thutmose II ascended without delay, adopting the full set of royal titles and the double crown in a coronation ceremony held inside Karnak. The procession moved along the temple avenues with priests carrying the sacred bark, and Hatshepsut walked beside her husband in her role as great royal wife, holding a sistrum and wearing the vulture headdress that marked her position. The event included the distribution of extra grain and beer to the people of Thebes, ensuring the transition felt continuous rather than disruptive. Immediately after, Thutmose II took up the daily audiences, reviewing the same types of reports his father had handled: grain tallies, border dispatches, and temple endowment lists with the same group of viziers and treasurers who had served the previous reign. The new reign settled into patterns similar to the earlier years, though on a smaller scale. Thutmose II directed a limited campaign into Nubia early on, sending troops to reinforce the forts established by his father and secure tribute routes for gold and cattle. The returning expedition delivered modest quantities of raw materials that funded continued work at Karnak, where masons added columns and reliefs depicting the new king offering to Amun. Hatshepsut oversaw the allocation of some of these resources to her own estates, directing extra labourers to repair irrigation ditches and plant additional flax fields that would supply linen for temple staff. Her daily estate meetings now included updates on how the Nubian tribute supported these local improvements, keeping the household's productivity aligned with the kingdom's needs. Daily life in the royal apartments adjusted only slightly. Thutmose II spent mornings in the audience hall and afternoons inspecting military training grounds or quarry sites near the river. Hatshepsut maintained her routine of morning ledger reviews, midday noble gatherings, and afternoon temple checks, adding occasional joint appearances with her husband at smaller festivals. Neferu, now a young child, joined some of these processions in a small litter, learning the rhythm of chants and the placement of offerings. The palace kitchens continued supplying the same staples: fish from the Nile, vegetables from palace plots, and beer brewed in the household yards with occasional additions of southern spices from the tribute shipments. A secondary wife named Iset gave birth to a son during this period, named Thutmose after his father. The child entered the royal household under the care of his own set of nurses in separate quarters, and Hatshepsut made arrangements for his inclusion in family religious observances without altering the priority given to Neferu. The presence of the young prince added another layer to court planning, with officials noting his growth alongside reports on the heir's military education. Thutmose II divided his attention between the two children, ensuring both received proper instruction while focusing the bulk of his public role on governance and temple support. Health concerns for Thutmose II emerged gradually over the following years. Physicians noted skin irritation and general fatigue during routine examinations, recommending rest periods and dietary adjustments that included more fresh fruits and reduced red meat. The king continued his duties but shortened outdoor inspections during the hotter months and relied more on written reports from provincial governors. Hatshepsut responded by increasing her own oversight of administrative details, reviewing additional scrolls on canal maintenance and tax collections so that minor delays could be addressed before they affected the treasury. Her steward expanded the household staff slightly to handle the extra correspondence, ensuring that estate produce reached the palace granaries on schedule. The court maintained stability through these adjustments. Nobles from the Delta and Upper Egypt continued sending representatives with local updates, and Hatshepsut received them in her reception room to discuss practical matters such as seed distribution or labour rotations. The vizier coordinated between the king's military priorities and her administrative notes, creating a balanced system where neither side of governance lagged. Religious festivals proceeded as planned, with Hatshepsut and Neferua participating in the Opet procession and the beautiful festival of the valley, carrying small bouquets and shaking sistra in the established sequence. As Thutmose II's condition worsened, physicians spent more time in the royal apartments preparing cooling ointments and monitoring his rest. The king reduced his public audiences to essential matters, delegating routine decisions to trusted officials, while Hatshepsut handled the flow of estate and temple reports. The palace staff adapted by moving meetings to cooler times of day and increasing the use of fans and shaded walkways. Neferua's lessons continued uninterrupted, now including basic hieroglyph practice under the same tutors who had instructed her mother years earlier. The king's death occurred around 1479 BCE after a reign of approximately 14 years. The embalming process began immediately in the dedicated facilities on the West Bank, and the palace again entered mourning with subdued lighting and simplified meals. Hatshepsut directed the household staff to organize the necessary supplies for the funeral linen wrappings, amulets, and jars of oils while coordinating with priests for the sequence of rites. The royal family gathered for private prayers, placing protective figures around the prepared body before it moved to the tomb site in the Valley of the Kings. Officials convened quickly to address the succession. The young prince Thutmose III, still a child of only 2 or 3 years, became the nominal king, requiring a regency arrangement. Hatshepsut's position as great royal wife and mother of the senior royal daughter placed her naturally at the centre of discussions. The vizier and high priests reviewed the administrative structure, confirming that daily operations, grain distribution, temple offerings, and border patrols would continue under established protocols. Messengers carried announcements to the nomes, reassuring local governors that the transition would preserve order. Mourning extended across Thebes for the required period, with public feasts limited and temple hymns shifted to solemn tones. Hatshepsut managed the palace during this time by reviewing supply lists for the upcoming funeral banquet and ensuring that Neferua and the young prince received consistent care from their nurses. The royal workshops prepared additional statues and reliefs for the new king's early monuments, while treasurers adjusted tax projections to account for any temporary slowdown in tribute collection. Uncertainties emerged in the weeks following the death, as officials considered the implications of a child ruler. Some governors sent inquiries about the exact division of authority, and Hatshepsut responded through her scribe with clear instructions on continued tax deliveries and canal repairs. The priesthood at Karnak requested confirmation of offering schedules, which she approved after consulting the vizier. Her inner concerns centered on maintaining the flow of resources to prevent any gap in temple funding or military readiness. Though she kept these thoughts focused on practical steps rather than speculation, the Nile flood arrived on schedule that year, bringing the usual silt and renewal that allowed planting to proceed without interruption. Hatshepsut used the inundation months to reorganize estate labor assignments and review long-term storage plans, ensuring the kingdom's granaries remained full. Court nobles adjusted their routines by directing more reports to her apartments, recognizing her steady oversight as the stabilizing force during the regency period. The immediate transition brought a quiet shift in palace atmosphere. Servants continued their tasks with the same efficiency, but meetings now included the young king's representatives alongside Hatshepsut's staff. The royal children received combined lessons in basic rituals, with Neferua taking a guiding role in simple demonstrations. Officials monitored border dispatches closely, reporting any minor disturbances in Nubia so that reinforcements could be prepared without delay. Hatshepsut's role expanded naturally into coordinating these elements, balancing her care for the two children with the administrative needs of the kingdom. She checked daily on the young prince's health and development, while directing the steward to allocate resources fairly between the two households. The court settled into a new rhythm of regency governance, where every decision aimed at preserving the continuity that had defined the dynasty since its founding. By the end of the mourning period, the palace had absorbed the change and returned to its core functions. Reports flowed steadily, temples received their offerings, and the river continued its cycle of flood and recession. The uncertainties of succession remained present but contained through careful management, setting the stage for the years ahead under Hatshepsut's increasing influence. Regent for young king with the young Thutmose III, now the nominal ruler at barely 3 years old, Hatshepsut stepped into the formal position of regent through a quiet agreement reached among the vizier, the high priest of Amun, and the senior officials who had served both her father and her husband. The arrangement followed established precedent for child kings, placing day-to-day authority in the hands of the senior royal woman who already managed substantial estates and temple affairs. She began each morning in her expanded reception room, where scribes unrolled the full set of state papyrus rolls that had previously gone first to Thutmose II. She examined grain inventories from the delta, troop movements along the Nubian border, and lists of temple endowments, marking small adjustments with her reed pen before the documents moved to the vizier for execution. The young king's daily needs required their own share of attention. Nurses brought Thutmose III to Hatshepsut's apartments twice each day for short visits, where she watched him take unsteady steps across reed mats or grasp small wooden blocks carved with simple hieroglyphs. She directed the selection of additional attendants from trusted noble families, ensuring the child received consistent feeding with milk and soft porridge, regular oil rubs to protect his skin from the dry air, and protective amulets updated as he grew. Neferua, now 7 or 8, joined these sessions and demonstrated basic gestures from her own early training, helping the nurses teach the toddler simple words and the correct way to hold a small sistrum during private household rites. Court advisors adjusted their routines to report directly to Hatshepsut in structured morning sessions. The vizier presented border dispatches first, describing minor patrols in Nubia that secured gold routes without requiring large expeditions. The treasurer followed with tallies of incoming tribute, noting how cedar shipments from Byblos supported ongoing repairs at Karnak. Hatshepsut asked precise questions about quantities and timelines, drawing on the administrative habits she had developed during her husband's reign. Officials noted her steady approach and began preparing their reports with extra detail, knowing she reviewed every figure before approving distributions to granaries or workshops. Religious oversight formed a central part of her regency duties. She visited Karnak several times each week to confirm that daily offerings proceeded without interruption, checking the placement of bread loaves, beer jars, and fresh flowers on the altars. Priests reported on the condition of temple storerooms and the schedule of festivals, and she approved small increases in staff when flood damage affected local fields. During these visits, she carried Thutmose III in a light litter for part of the route, allowing the child to see the processions and hear the chants so that the rhythms of temple life became familiar early. The high priest of Amun consulted her on endowment adjustments, and she allocated resources from her own estates to maintain the flow of goods when state supplies ran short. Palace life settled into a combined rhythm that balanced the regent's expanded role with the needs of the two royal children. Meals in the main hall now included both Neferua and Thutmose III at a low table, where servants cut food into small portions and supervised the toddlers eating. Hatshepsut reviewed household accounts immediately after breakfast, directing her steward to coordinate deliveries between her estates and the main palace kitchens. Afternoons often involved short inspections of workshops, where carpenters repaired chariots or masons shaped replacement blocks for temple pylons, ensuring that work continued at the same pace as under the previous reign. Nobles from across Egypt sent representatives more frequently during the early Regency months, bringing local reports on canal conditions and harvest projections. Hatshepsut received them in her reception room, listening to accounts of silt buildup in delta waterways or labour shortages in Upper Egypt quarries. She responded with written instructions on resource sharing between districts, drawing from her earlier estate management experience. These exchanges built a network of direct communication that bypassed some of the slower official channels, allowing quicker responses to minor disruptions before they affected tax collections. Her inner habits adapted to the heavier workload. She kept a separate set of ostraca for personal notes on recurring issues, delayed grain shipments, priestly requests for extra oil, or updates on the young king's health, and reviewed them each evening by lamplight before storing them in a locked chest. This practice helped her track patterns over months and prevented small oversights from accumulating. She developed a routine of walking the palace gardens alone at dusk with one attendant, checking the condition of irrigation channels that fed the pomegranate trees, and noting any plants that needed replacement. These quiet circuits provided the only extended time for reflection, where she considered the long-term stability of the dynasty rather than immediate crises. The political forces around her included a circle of experienced officials who had served Thutmose I and II. Some, like the treasurer and the overseer of granaries, offered advice based on decades of record-keeping and quietly supported her decisions. Others, particularly military commanders who had trained Thutmose II, watched the regency closely, but focused their attention on border security rather than internal administration. Hatshepsut maintained balance by consulting the vizier on all major appointments and ensuring that military reports reached her alongside civilian ones, so no single department dominated the flow of information. Daily culture inside the palace continued its established patterns. Servants prepared the same Nile fish stews and lentil dishes, now portioned for the children's smaller appetites. Weavers in the women's quarters produced additional linen for the growing household, and tailors adjusted Thutmose III's small kilts as he outgrew each set. Festivals proceeded on schedule, with Hatshepsut and Neferua participating in the Opet procession while the young king watched from a shaded pavilion. The public distribution of extra beer and bread during these events reassured the people of Thebes that the kingdom remained secure under the regent's oversight. As months turned into years, Hatshepsut's confidence in handling state affairs increased through repeated practice. She began approving larger temple projects, such as the addition of new offering tables at the Shrine of Mut, after reviewing cost estimates and labour rosters herself. Scribes noted her growing familiarity with the full range of administrative terminology, and officials started addressing more complex matters to her directly rather than routing them through intermediaries. The young king's education progressed under tutors who combined basic hieroglyph practice with simple stories of past pharaohs, and Hatshepsut occasionally sat in on these sessions to ensure the lessons aligned with the dynasty's traditions. Concerns about the future remained practical rather than overt. She monitored the health of key advisors and prepared contingency notes on estate management in case any senior official needed replacement. The Nile's annual inundation provided a reliable measure of stability. When flood levels matched previous years, she directed extra grain storage to buffer against possible dry seasons ahead. During these flood months, palace routines slowed slightly, allowing more time for the children's play in the courtyards and for her own review of long-term endowment lists. Court nobles responded to her steady leadership by increasing their own efficiency in supplying reports. Governors in distant nomes sent more frequent updates on local conditions, knowing that decisions could reach them quickly through her scribe. This flow of information created a sense of continuous governance that prevented any noticeable gap in authority. Hatshepsut allocated portions of incoming tribute to support the young king's future military training, setting aside bronze weapons and chariot parts in dedicated storerooms. Religious devotion deepened through her regency role. She commissioned small statues of Thutmose III for placement in household shrines and participated in the dedication rites, reciting the standard formulas that linked the child king to Amun. Priests appreciated her attention to ritual details and responded by maintaining precise records of offerings that she reviewed monthly. The palace workshops expanded their output to meet the combined needs of the royal children. Ongoing temple repairs. Carpenters produced additional toy chariots for Thutmose III's play, while continuing work on full-size vessels for river transport. Hatshepsut inspected these projects periodically, noting the quality of cedar joints and the evenness of painted scenes. By the later years of the regency, around the time Thutmose III reached 7 or 8, Hatshepsut had integrated the full machinery of state into her daily oversight. She balanced care for the young king's development with the administrative demands of the kingdom, managed a wide circle of advisors through consistent consultation, and maintained the flow of resources that kept temples supplied and borders secure. The court operated with the same orderly rhythm as before, now centered on her apartments where reports arrived each morning and decisions moved out each afternoon. The Nile continued its cycles, and the dynasty's continuity rested on the practical systems she had strengthened through steady attention. Path to Pharaoh's. The regency continued into its 5th and 6th years. Hatshepsut's handling of state affairs had become the main channel through which all major decisions passed. She reviewed the complete set of daily reports in her reception room each morning, including detailed accounts of grain movements from the delta, copper and timber arrivals at northern ports, and labour assignments at quarry sites along the Nile. Her steward coordinated the delivery of these scrolls from the vizier's office, and she marked adjustments directly on the papyrus with notes about reallocating workers or increasing supplies to specific temples. This process allowed her to address small imbalances before they affected larger operations, and officials grew accustomed to receiving her written instructions within the same day. Her connection with the priesthood at Karnak strengthened through regular meetings with the high priest and other senior temple officials. She approved appointments to key positions within the Amun cult and directed extra resources from her estates to support daily offerings and festival preparations. These steps ensured that temple operations remained fully supplied, and the priests in turn provided consistent backing for her administrative choices. The relationship developed steadily, with the high priest offering advice on religious protocol during her visits to the inner sanctuaries, where she checked the condition of altars and the sequence of rites performed by the staff. During this period, Hatshepsut began to appear in new temple reliefs that showed her performing actions traditionally associated with kings. Sculptors first carved her in queenly form, wearing the vulture headdress and offering to Amun, but over successive projects the images shifted to include elements of male royal regalia, such as the Nemes headcloth combined with a female body. These changes appeared gradually on walls at Karnak and smaller shrines, reflecting her increasing involvement in state rituals. She reviewed the designs herself during site visits, ensuring the proportions and inscriptions matched the established patterns used by previous rulers. The young Thutmose III continued his training in the palace under tutors who focused on basic military skills and religious education. Hatshepsut arranged for him to observe selected ceremonies at Karnak and allocated time each week for him to practice with small bows and model chariots in the training grounds. Neferua, now entering her teenage years, assisted in some of these sessions by demonstrating correct ritual gestures, helping maintain a sense of family continuity in the royal household. The children's routines remained integrated with palace life, with nurses and scribes reporting daily on their progress to Hatshepsut during her afternoon reviews. Political support from key officials grew firmer as she demonstrated consistent management of resources. The treasurer and vizier worked closely with her on budget allocations, and she selected reliable administrators for provincial posts based on their performance records. These appointments helped secure loyalty across the nomes, with governors sending more frequent updates on local conditions that she incorporated into her planning. Nobles from Thebes and other centres adjusted their own estate management to align with her directives, creating a network of coordinated activity that kept the kingdom stable without major disruptions. Hatshepsut developed a personal system for tracking long-term projects, using separate ostraca stored in her private chest to note progress on temple expansions and resource needs. She reviewed these notes each evening after the lamps were lit, cross-referencing them against the official scrolls to maintain accuracy. This habit allowed her to anticipate shortages in materials or labour and issue early corrections, building her confidence in overseeing the entire administrative structure. Religious claims began to feature more prominently in official inscriptions as the years advanced. Reliefs at Karnak and other sites started to include scenes that presented her as the direct offspring of Amun, with the god shown visiting her mother in the form of Thutmose I. These depictions followed standard artistic conventions for divine birth narratives, emphasizing her legitimacy through the highest religious authority. She directed the placement of these scenes during temple visits, ensuring the texts used precise phrasing that linked her rule to the will of the gods without altering established ritual language. Building activity increased under her direction, with work crews at Karnak adding new columns and shrines using stone from the southern quarries. She inspected the sites periodically, noting the alignment of blocks and the quality of carvings that depicted royal offerings. Additional projects included repairs to older structures damaged in earlier periods, with labourers assigned from palace-controlled villages. These efforts provided steady employment and demonstrated her commitment to maintaining the kingdom's sacred spaces, which in turn reinforced support from the priesthood and the general population along the Nile. Court dynamics shifted gradually as officials recognized the scope of her authority. Military commanders continued to handle border security in Nubia and the north, reporting directly on patrol results and tribute collections. Hatshepsut incorporated these reports into her morning sessions, allocating portions of incoming gold and cattle to temple funds or estate maintenance. The young king's presence remained central to official announcements, with his name appearing alongside hers in formal decrees to preserve the appearance of joint rule. Daily life in the palace incorporated these changes without disrupting established routines. Servants prepared the same range of meals using produce from the royal estates, and Hatshepsut continued her walks through the gardens to check irrigation channels and plant health. She spent time with Neferure discussing household matters, and with Thutmose III observing his progress in reading simple texts, ensuring both children received balanced attention amid the wider responsibilities. Her inner focus stayed on practical stability, monitoring flood levels each inundation season and adjusting storage plans accordingly. She noted patterns in harvest reports from different nomes and directed seed distributions to maintain consistent yields. These steps prevented any noticeable shortages and kept the flow of goods steady through the granaries and workshops. As the 7th year of the regency approached, Hatshepsut's role had evolved through these accumulated responsibilities and representations. She adopted additional elements of pharaonic protocol in private ceremonies and began using fuller royal titles in internal records. The court accepted these developments as extensions of her regency duties, with no interruption to the daily operations of government or temple life. The political atmosphere remained one of orderly continuity, supported by the alliances she had cultivated and the visible results of her management. Nobles and priests alike participated in the growing number of projects, contributing resources and labour that reflected their alignment with her leadership. Thutmose III's education advanced steadily, preparing him for his eventual responsibilities while Hatshepsut maintained the systems that kept Egypt secure and prosperous. Religious festivals provided opportunities for public displays of her expanded role. During the Opet celebration, she participated in the processions with increased prominence, carrying symbols of kingship alongside the sacred bark. These events allowed the people of Thebes to see the royal family functioning as a unit, with her oversight ensuring smooth organization and generous distributions of food and drink. Hatshepsut's habit of personal review extended to the planning of larger monuments. where she considered the placement of future obelisks and chapels that would honour the gods and the dynasty. She consulted with architects on measurements and materials, incorporating details from earlier royal projects to maintain consistency in style and scale. The Nile's cycles continued to frame the kingdom's rhythm, with the annual flood bringing renewed fertility and the opportunity to assess long-term plans. Hatshepsut used these quieter months to refine her notes on resource distribution and to prepare for upcoming religious observances. By the close of this transitional period, her position had shifted through careful, incremental steps that blended administrative competence with religious and artistic expressions of authority. The court and the wider kingdom operated under her guidance with the same steady efficiency that had marked the earlier years, setting the foundation for the full assumption of pharaonic titles that followed, crowning as Pharaoh. The transition reached its formal completion in the 7th year of the nominal reign of Thutmose III, around 1473 BCE, when Hatshepsut decided the time had come to assume the full titles and authority of Pharaoh. The regency had already placed every aspect of governance under her direct control for years, but the coronation would make that authority official in the eyes of the gods, the priesthood, and the people along the entire length of the Nile. Preparations began quietly in her reception room, with a series of private meetings involving the high priest of Amun, the vizier, and the treasurer. They reviewed the exact sequence of rites used by previous kings, adjusting only where necessary to fit the current situation of a female ruler who had already proven her competence in administration and temple oversight. The high priest confirmed that oracles at Karnak had shown favourable signs, and the vizier drafted the announcements that would go out to provincial governors once the ceremony concluded. The coronation day itself started before dawn in the palace. Servants brought Hatshepsut to the purification chamber, where priests poured water from 4 sacred vases over her, while reciting formulas that cleansed her of any earthly concerns. She then dressed in a new set of royal garments prepared by the palace tailors, a pleated linen kilt similar to those worn by male kings, a broad collar of gold and turquoise, and the white crown of Upper Egypt first, followed by the red crown of Lower Egypt to form the double crown. Neferur assisted with the final adjustments to the vulture headdress that combined with the crowns, while the young Thutmose III watched from a nearby stool under the care of his nurses. The royal children wore their own formal linen and small collars for the occasion, and Hatshepsut made sure both received a quick explanation of the day's importance, before the group moved toward Karnak in litters carried by palace bearers. The procession along the avenue to the temple included the standard military escort and groups of priests carrying incense burners and sacred standards. Crowds lined the route in Thebes, kept in order by officials who distributed small loaves of bread and jars of beer as the group passed. At Karnak, the high priest led Hatshepsut into the inner sanctuary of Amun, where she offered incense and flowers at the god's statue and received confirmation of her divine selection. The crowning took place in the central hall, with the high priest placing the double crown on her head while reciting the full set of 5 royal names she had chosen. She became Horus Powerful of Kas, the 2 ladies flourishing of years, Horus of Gold, Divine of Appearances, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Ma'at Kare, and daughter of Hatshepsut. Each name was inscribed on a fresh papyrus scroll that the scribes carried back to the palace for copying onto temple walls and official seals. Following the crowning, Hatshepsut performed the first acts of her new role by running a ritual circuit around the temple markers that symbolized the boundaries of Egypt, then presenting offerings at the altars of the other major gods. Thutmose III stood beside her during these steps, holding a small sistrum as instructed, so that the public records would show the 2 rulers together. The ceremony concluded with a public declaration from the temple pylons, where heralds read the new titles and announced extra distributions of grain and meat to the people of Thebes and surrounding villages. Boats carried the news north to Memphis and south into Nubia, ensuring every nome received word within days. Back at the palace, the immediate changes were practical rather than dramatic. Hatshepsut's apartments received updated furniture with her new cartouches carved into the wooden frames, and her steward adjusted the household accounts to reflect the fuller royal titles on all supply lists. She continued her morning review of state reports exactly as before, but now the scrolls carried her pharaonic seals alongside those of Thutmose III. The young king, still only about 8 years old, returned to his regular lessons after the ceremony, practicing with bows and reading simple texts while his nurses kept his schedule unchanged. Neferure, now in her mid-teens, took on a more visible role in household rituals, helping to organize the daily offerings that Hatshepsut reviewed each afternoon. Court officials responded with steady acceptance of the new arrangement. The vizier and treasurer continued their daily presentations in the audience hall, addressing Hatshepsut with the full royal protocol while keeping Thutmose III's name on all joint decrees. Military commanders reported the same border patrols and tribute deliveries, noting no disruptions along the Nubian forts or northern trade routes. Nobles from distant estates sent their representatives with the usual updates on canal conditions and harvests, and Hatshepsut issued instructions in her new capacity without altering the flow of resources. The priesthood at Karnak began carving reliefs that showed her in fully male, kingly form, complete with the false beard and broad shoulders, while still including her female name in the inscriptions to maintain accuracy. Daily life inside the palace incorporated the coronation without major shifts in rhythm. Servants prepared the same Nile fish, lentil stews, and bread for meals, though the kitchen staff added special honey cakes for the celebration week. Hatshepsut continued her evening garden walks to check irrigation channels and plant health, now wearing a lighter version of the Nemes headcloth during these private moments. She developed the habit of reviewing the new temple relief designs each week during site visits, ensuring the proportions matched those of earlier kings, and that the texts used standard phrasing for offerings and victories. These checks kept her connected to the building projects already underway at Karnak and elsewhere. Her inner focus remained on long-term stability. She noted the reactions of key advisors during the first post-coronation meetings and made small adjustments to staff assignments where any hesitation appeared. Concerns about the young king's eventual role stayed practical. She allocated specific bronze weapons and chariot parts for his training, and reviewed his tutor's reports weekly to track his progress in military skills. The coronation had removed any lingering questions about authority, allowing her to plan larger projects with greater confidence, yet she kept Thutmose III's name prominent in all official records to preserve the dynasty's continuity. Religious participation expanded immediately after the ceremony. Hatshepsut commissioned new statues of herself as pharaoh for placement in household shrines and smaller temples, and she oversaw the dedication rites where priests recited the standard formulas linking her to Amun. Festivals in the following months included larger public distributions because of the extra grain set aside for the occasion, and she made sure Neferure and Thutmose III appeared with her during the processions so the people saw the royal family united. The Opet festival that year featured additional barges and longer routes, with Hatshepsut walking beside the sacred bark in her new regalia. The political atmosphere in Thebes settled into a new equilibrium. Governors in the nomes adjusted their tax deliveries to reflect the updated royal titles, and workshops across Egypt began stamping goods with the cartouche matkare. Hatshepsut used the increased authority to accelerate stone shipments from Aswan quarries for ongoing temple work, directing teams of masons to add scenes of her coronation to the walls at Karnak. These carvings showed her receiving the crowns from Amun and performing the ritual run, providing a permanent record that officials and priests could reference in future years. The Nile's annual inundation arrived on schedule shortly after the coronation, bringing the usual silt and allowing Hatshepsut to direct extra labour to her estates for planting. She reviewed flood height records at the Karnak Nilometer and adjusted storage plans accordingly, ensuring granaries remained full. During these quieter months, she spent additional time with the royal children, watching Thutmose III practice chariot driving in the training grounds and discussing estate management with Neferure. Court nobles and common people alike noted the smooth transition through the generous distributions and continued flow of goods. Marketplaces in Thebes sold more produce because of the extra supplies released for the celebration, and craftsmen received steady commissions for new royal statues and seals. Hatshepsut's steward reported higher than usual deliveries from provincial estates in the months following the announcement, indicating broad acceptance across the kingdom. Her personal habits adapted to the new titles without fanfare. She kept the same wooden chest for her ostraca notes on administrative matters, now labelling them with her pharaonic name, and continued her private evening reviews by lamplight. The coronation had confirmed what years of regency had already established, allowing her to focus on the steady work of governance rather than questions of legitimacy. Thutmose III's education proceeded alongside her own oversight of state affairs, with tutors reporting balanced progress in reading, ritual, and military training. The court workshops increased output to produce additional items bearing the new cartouches jars for temple oils, linen bolts for offerings, and small amulets for distribution during festivals. Hatshepsut inspected samples of these goods during her afternoon rounds, ensuring quality remained consistent. These small checks reinforced the practical side of her new role, linking the ceremony's grandeur to the daily machinery that kept Egypt functioning. By the end of the coronation year, the palace had absorbed the change completely. Reports flowed in the same steady stream each morning, temples received their offerings on schedule, and the royal children continued their routines under her guidance. The double rule with Thutmose III remained in place on all formal documents, preserving the line of succession while Hatshepsut exercised the full powers of Pharaoh. The Nile continued its cycles, and the kingdom moved forward with the same orderly rhythm that had defined the dynasty, now under her complete and official leadership. Grand construction projects. With the coronation complete and her titles now fixed on every official seal and temple wall, Hatshepsut turned her attention to a series of building projects that would mark her reign across the landscape of Egypt. The decision to construct a new mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari came early, chosen because the site sat directly opposite Karnak on the west bank of the Nile, nestled against the steep cliffs in a natural bay that had already held the earlier temple of Mentuhotep II. She selected the location after several inspection trips by litter, where she stood on the rocky ground and noted how the morning sun struck the cliffs and how the processional route from the river could connect the new structure to the existing valley temples. The architect Senenmut, who had served her since the Regency years, presented initial sketches on large papyrus sheets during morning sessions in her reception room, showing 3 rising terraces linked by wide ramps and lined with columns shaped like bundled papyrus stalks. Work crews arrived at the site within weeks of the coronation. Labourers came from villages across Upper and Lower Egypt, organised into teams of 200 men, each under 4 men, who reported daily progress back to Thebes by boat. Stonecutters at the Aswan quarries received orders for fine white limestone blocks, which were loaded onto barges and floated downstream during the sailing season. At the Deir el-Bahari site itself, masons levelled the ground for the lowest terrace while others cut into the cliff face to create space for the innermost sanctuary. Hatshepsut visited the construction area every few months, travelling across the river in the royal barge and walking the unfinished ramps with Senenmut at her side. She examined the alignment of the first columns, ran her hand over freshly cut stone to check its smoothness, and discussed adjustments to the ramp slopes so that the processional bark could move without difficulty during future festivals. The temple design grew more detailed as construction advanced. The lowest terrace would feature gardens planted with myrrh trees brought back from earlier expeditions, while the middle level held shrines to Anubis and Hathor. The uppermost terrace included a main sanctuary for Amun, and rows of statues showing Hatshepsut in pharaonic form, some as Osiris with crossed arms holding the crook and flail. Sculptors worked in temporary shelters at the edge of the site, carving these figures from single blocks of limestone and granite, their mallets striking steadily from dawn until the heat of midday forced a pause. Workers received daily rations of bread, beer, dried fish and onions delivered by supply boats that tied up at a new stone quay built specifically for the project. The steady employment drew families from nearby villages, creating temporary settlements of reed huts where women baked extra loaves and children carried water jars to the stone cutters. At Karnak on the east bank, parallel projects moved forward under the same direction. Hatshepsut ordered the erection of 2 massive obelisks in the central court, each cut from a single granite shaft at Aswan, and transported on a special barge pulled by multiple rowing crews. She oversaw the planning sessions where engineers calculated the exact weight and the number of ropes needed for the final raising, then watched from a shaded platform as the stones were levered upright on their bases. The obelisks stood over 90 feet tall once in place, their sides covered with inscriptions that recorded her titles and the divine approval she had received at coronation. Additional work at Karnak included a new pylon gateway and expansions to the Temple of Mut, where teams of masons added columned halls using stone from the same quarries that supplied Deir el-Bahri. Resources for all these projects came directly from the tribute and taxes that continued to arrive at Thebes. Gold from Nubian mines funded the purchase of additional copper tools for the masons, while cedar logs from Byblos provided the scaffolding and the heavy beams for the temple roofs. Hatshepsut reviewed the supply lists each week in her reception room, approving extra grain shipments from the delta when the number of workers at Deir el-Bahri increased. The treasurer kept separate accounts for each site, and she cross-checked the figures against the foreman reports that arrived by boat. This careful tracking prevented shortages and ensured that temple construction did not draw resources away from the regular maintenance of irrigation canals or the feeding of the palace household. Daily life for the thousands of men at the building sites followed a predictable pattern tied to the Nile seasons. During the inundation months, when fields lay underwater, more labourers arrived because farm work paused, and the crews focused on moving stone blocks along the wet slipways. In the dry season, the pace slowed slightly to allow for precise carving and painting of reliefs that showed Hatshepsut offering to the gods. Foremen rotated shifts so that work continued from first light until evening, with short breaks for meals eaten in the shade of canvas shelters. Medical attendants treated minor injuries with bandages and herbal salves, and scribes recorded the names of workers who completed their service so they could receive small plots of land as reward. Hatshepsut's inner attention during these years centered on the lasting impact each structure would have. She kept personal ostraca notes on the progress at Deir el-Bahri, noting which sections of relief carving needed refinement and which statue poses best conveyed her role as pharaoh. She worried about the weight distribution on the terraces and consulted Senenmut repeatedly about reinforcing the foundations against future floods. These concerns remained private, discussed only during site visits or late evening planning sessions, but they shaped her decisions on material thickness and drainage channels cut into the rock. Neferua and Thutmose III visited the sites occasionally with their mother, riding in litters and watching the stone being dressed. Neferua showed particular interest in the painted scenes on the walls, asking about the colours mixed from ground minerals and the sequence of carving. Thutmose III, now approaching his teenage years, observed the heavy lifting teams and later practiced similar coordination in his military training exercises. Their presence reminded the workers that the royal family took direct interest in the projects, and Hatshepsut used these visits to explain simple aspects of the design so the children understood how the temples served both the gods and the dynasty. The court officials who oversaw the labour rosters adjusted their own routines to support the building program. The overseer of works travelled between Thebes and the quarries, carrying updated orders from Hatshepsut and returning with samples of stone for her inspection. The high priest at Karnak coordinated the religious dedications for each new section completed, ensuring that offerings accompanied every stage so the structures received divine protection. Nobles from distant nomes sent additional workers as part of their tax obligations, and Hatshepsut acknowledged these contributions in short written replies that the vizier delivered by messenger boat. Other smaller projects filled the gaps between the major ones. She directed repairs to temples in the delta and the addition of new shrines at sites along the river where local governors had requested support. Each of these received attention in her weekly review sessions, where she allocated modest quantities of limestone and assigned teams of 20 or 30 men. The steady pace of construction across the kingdom created a sense of ongoing activity that reached even the smallest villages through the movement of supply boats and returning labourers. By the middle years of her reign, the Deir el-Bahari temple had risen to its full height. The terraces stood complete with their columns, ramps and gardens, and sculptors began the final polishing of the Osiris statues that lined the upper level. Hatshepsut made a special visit to dedicate the main sanctuary, walking through the finished halls while priests burned incense and recited the standard hymns. She examined the reliefs that depicted her divine birth and the transport of the obelisks, noting how the carved figures matched the living people she saw around her each day. The projects brought visible changes to life along the Nile. Villages near the construction sites grew temporarily larger, with extra bread ovens and water jars appearing outside the reed huts. Families of workers received regular payments in grain and cloth, which they carried home at the end of their service periods. In Thebes itself, the workshops that produced paint and tools operated at full capacity, and the river quays stayed busy with arriving barges. Hatshepsut noted these effects during her regular crossings and adjusted supply deliveries to keep the pace even. Her personal habits adapted to the demands of oversight. She continued her evening garden walks at the palace, but now included short discussions with Senenmut about the next phase of painting or the placement of offering tables. The wooden chest in her apartments held more ostraca than before, each one labelled with the name of a specific project and the latest measurements or material needs. These records allowed her to maintain control even when she could not visit every site in person. Religious life at the new temple began even before full completion. Priests moved into temporary quarters near the sanctuary and started daily offerings so that the structure could function as a living place of worship. Hatshepsut approved the appointment of additional staff from Theban families and ensured that the storerooms received regular deliveries of beer, bread and oil. The beautiful festival of the valley gained new significance once the temple stood ready, with the sacred bark of Amun now able to rest in the completed sanctuary during its annual journey. The building program reflected the resources and stability she had maintained since the coronation. Tribute from Nubia and the Levant continued to supply the necessary materials, while the administrative systems she had strengthened kept labour organised and supplied. Workers from every nome participated, and the finished structures stood as visible proof of the kingdom's prosperity under her direction. Deir el-Bahari in particular rose as a landmark visible from the river, its white terraces catching the sun and reminding travellers of the Pharaoh who had ordered its creation. As the later stages of construction approached completion, Hatshepsut began planning the placement of additional statues and the carving of final inscriptions that would record her achievements for future generations. She reviewed the texts with the high priest and Senenmut, ensuring every phrase followed the established royal style. The projects had occupied a steady portion of her attention for nearly a decade, yet she kept the same measured approach she had used in earlier administrative work, balancing the demands of building with the ongoing needs of governance and the royal household. The Nile continued its annual cycle, and each flood brought fresh opportunities to move stone and plant the myrrh trees in the temple gardens. The kingdom's workshops and quarries operated in rhythm with these seasons, and the people who laboured on the monuments returned to their villages with stories of the great structures rising on the west bank. Hatshepsut's direction of these works had drawn together resources and skills from across the land, creating monuments that would stand long after her reign and serve as the visible legacy of her time as pharaoh, planning, Punt, Voyagean. Once the major phases of temple construction at Deir el-Bahari and Karnak had advanced far enough, for regular oversight rather than daily supervision, Hatshepsut turned to a long-discussed project that would bring rare goods directly to Egypt, without relying solely on overland middlemen. The land of Punt, known from earlier records as a source of myrrh, frankincense, ebony, ivory and live animals, lay far to the south along the Red Sea coast. Expeditions to Punt had occurred under previous kings, but none in recent memory had matched the scale she now planned. The idea took shape during quiet evening discussions in her reception room with Senenmut and the overseer of the treasury, where they reviewed old papyrus rolls describing the route, the required ships, and the tribute that had arrived in past centuries. The planning began with a detailed assessment of Egypt's shipbuilding capacity. Hatshepsut summoned the chief of the royal dockyards at Wadi el-Jarf and the overseer of timber supplies to the palace. They spread large drawings on low tables showing the design of seagoing vessels, long narrow hulls with high prows and sterns, reinforced with cedar beams from byblows, and fitted with single square sails for catching the north wind on the return journey. She asked precise questions about the number of oarsmen needed per ship, the storage capacity for water jars and provisions, and the amount of rope required for rigging. The dockyard chief estimated that 5 large ships could carry the necessary cargo and crew, each measuring about 60 feet in length and capable of holding 30 rowers plus additional sailors and guards. Hatshepsut approved the construction of these vessels at the Nile shipyards near Thebes, directing that work begin immediately so the fleet could depart during the next favourable sailing season. Resource allocation followed next. The treasurer presented lists of available goods for trade: strings of faience beads, bolts of fine linen, copper tools, and small gold ingots, all items that Punt chiefs valued highly. Hatshepsut reviewed the quantities, adjusting upward the number of linen bolts after checking her own estate inventories to ensure the palace stores would not run short. She also ordered the preparation of special gift items, carved wooden boxes filled with Egyptian honey and wine, and small statues of Amun made from gilded wood. These would serve as diplomatic gestures to secure goodwill from the local rulers. The planning sessions included the high priest of Amun, who advised on the religious preparations offerings to Hathor, protector of desert travellers, and to Sopdu, guardian of the eastern routes, so that the expedition carried divine favour from the start. The route required careful mapping based on earlier accounts. Ships would sail down the Nile from Thebes to the Delta, then cross to the Red Sea through a canal that linked the river to the Bitter Lakes, a waterway maintained since the time of earlier dynasties. From there the fleet would proceed south along the coast, stopping at known wells for water and resting at sheltered bays. The journey would take several months each way, with the return aided by seasonal winds that blew northward in the appropriate season. Hatshepsut consulted navigators who had made shorter Red Sea voyages, asking about the locations of reefs, the timing of storms, and the best places to beach the ships for repairs. She directed the inclusion of extra spare timbers and sailcloth in the cargo holds to handle any damage from rough seas. Crew selection occupied several weeks of preparation. Hatshepsut wanted experienced sailors who knew the Red Sea currents, along with soldiers for protection and scribes to record every detail of the voyage. The expedition leader, a trusted naval officer named Nihasi, received his appointment after presenting a clear plan for managing supplies and maintaining discipline. She met with him privately to discuss the importance of accurate records, measurements of distances travelled, descriptions of the land and people encountered, and tallies of goods acquired so that future expeditions could benefit from the experience. Additional specialists joined the group: a physician to treat illnesses, a carpenter for on-site repairs, and interpreters familiar with southern languages from previous trade contacts. Logistical details filled the daily reports that reached her apartments. The dockyards reported progress on hull construction, with carpenters shaping planks and caulking seams with pitch. Supply officers tallied the number of water jars needed, hundreds for the outward journey alone, and arranged for their filling from the Nile at departure. Food provisions included dried fish, hard bread, lentils, onions, and dates, packed in sealed jars to last the long sea crossing. Hatshepsut reviewed these lists personally, approving increases in the amount of beer barrels after learning that the crew preferred it to plain water for maintaining morale during the hot voyage. Religious preparations ran parallel to the practical ones. Hatshepsut ordered the construction of small shrines on each ship, complete with portable altars and statues of Hathor and Amun. Priests from Karnak prepared amulets for every crew member, scarabs inscribed with protective spells, and performed a dedication ceremony at the dockyards before the vessels launched. She participated in the rite, offering incense and reciting standard formulas that asked for safe passage and successful return. These acts ensured that the expedition carried the full weight of divine approval, which in turn reassured the families of the sailors who gathered along the riverbank to watch the ships take shape. The court felt the effects of the planning in small but noticeable ways. Workshops that normally produced temple reliefs shifted some workers to carving wooden boxes and inlaying them with faience for the trade gifts. The treasury adjusted its monthly accounts to reserve funds for the expedition, without reducing temple offerings or palace supplies. Nobles whose estates supplied linen or grain received requests for extra contributions, and most complied promptly, seeing the voyage as a way to increase Egypt's wealth through direct access to punt goods. Hatshepsut acknowledged these efforts in written replies delivered by messenger, reinforcing the sense of shared purpose across the kingdom. As the sailing season approached, final inspections took place at the dockyards. Hatshepsut travelled by barge to view the completed ships, walking their decks to check the storage compartments and the rigging. She spoke briefly with the crews, confirming that provisions were loaded and that each man understood his role. The vessels received names that reflected their purpose, such as Ammon's favour and Hathor's protection painted along the hulls in clear hieroglyphs. She oversaw the loading of the last trade goods, ensuring that the gift boxes sat securely in the captain's cabin for presentation to the punt chief upon arrival. Neferu and Thutmose III observed parts of the preparations from the palace balconies that overlooked the river. Neferu asked questions about the sails and the route, while Thutmose III watched the rowers practicing their strokes in smaller training boats. Hatshepsut explained the expedition's goals in simple terms, pointing out how the myrrh trees they hoped to bring back would grow in the temple gardens at Deir el-Bahri and supply incense for years to come. The children's interest helped maintain a calm atmosphere among the palace staff, who saw the voyage as an extension of the building projects already underway. The final days before departure included a large offering ceremony at Karnak, where Hatshepsut presented additional gifts to Amun and asked for protection over the fleet. The high priest led the prayers, and the court officials attended in full regalia. After the rite, she returned to the palace to review one last set of supply manifests, confirming that nothing essential had been overlooked. Messengers carried sealed orders to the canal guards and coastal stations along the Red Sea route, instructing them to provide water and assistance when the ships passed. The planning phase had stretched over more than a year, involving every major department of the palace and drawing resources from across Egypt. Hatshepsut's steady oversight ensured that the fleet would depart fully equipped, with clear instructions and divine blessings. The expedition represented not only a commercial venture but a demonstration of the kingdom's organizational strength under her rule. As the ships prepared to cast off, the palace settled back into its routines, though with an undercurrent of anticipation for the news that would arrive months later. The Nile continued its seasonal flow, carrying the last supply boats to the delta for the final leg of preparation. Hatshepsut kept a small personal record of the departure date and the names of the lead officers, adding it to her chest of ostraca for future reference. The voyage would test the systems she had built: administrative, religious, and logistical, and bring back goods that would enrich the temples and the treasury alike. With the fleet ready and the crew assembled, the kingdom waited for the winds to turn favourable and carry the ships southward toward Punt. Triumphant return from Punt. The fleet of 5 ships returned to Egyptian waters after more than 8 months away, sailing up the Nile from the Red Sea Canal during the season when the north wind made the upstream journey steady and reliable. The vessels tied up at the stone quays near Thebes one clear morning in the 9th year of Hatshepsut's reign, their hulls still bearing traces of salt and sun-bleached paint from the long voyage. Crew members lined the decks in clean linen kilts, waving palm branches to signal their safe arrival, while the lead ship carried the expedition commander Nihasi standing at the prow. Word spread quickly through the city, carried by runners from the docks to the palace and the temple precincts at Karnak. By midday, crowds had gathered along the riverbank: servants from noble houses, craftsmen from the workshops, and families from nearby villages all drawn by the promise of news from a land most had only heard about in stories. Hatshepsut received the first report in her reception room before the unloading began. Niazi and the chief scribe of the expedition entered, carrying sealed papyrus rolls and small sample jars. They described the journey in measured detail: the calm crossing of the Red Sea, the arrival at the Punt coast where local chiefs met them on the beach with their families, the exchange of gifts, and the successful loading of cargo. The scribe read aloud from his log the list of goods acquired: large sacks of myrrh and frankincense resin, living myrrh trees carefully packed in baskets with their roots wrapped in damp cloth, ebony logs, ivory tusks, leopard skins, live baboons and monkeys, and quantities of gold dust measured in small linen bags. Hatshepsut listened while examining the samples, opening a jar to smell the sharp, resinous scent of fresh myrrh, and running her fingers over a piece of ebony to feel its dense grain. She approved the immediate transfer of the most perishable items, trees and animals, to the palace gardens and temple enclosures for safekeeping. Unloading proceeded over the next several days under close supervision. Workers from the palace docks carried the cargo ashore in orderly lines, using wooden sledges for the heavier ebony logs and shoulder poles for the myrrh sacks. Scribes stood at tables set up on the quay, recording each item as it came off the ships: 131 myrrh trees, 40 sacks of frankincense, 22 large ivory tusks, quantities of gold and electrum, and various exotic animals including greyhounds from Punt and long-tailed monkeys. The live myrrh trees received priority. Gardeners transferred them at once to specially prepared beds near Deir el-Bahari, where the soil had been enriched and irrigation channels dug to mimic the moist conditions of their homeland. The animals went to fenced enclosures in the palace grounds, where keepers fed them fresh fruit and monitored their adjustment to the Egyptian climate. The arrival affected daily life across Thebes in immediate ways. Market stalls near the riverfront filled with small portions of frankincense and myrrh, sold by merchants who had bought shares from the expedition's surplus. Ordinary households burned the new incense during evening prayers, filling narrow streets with its thick, sweet smoke. Craftsmen in the palace workshops received the ebony logs and began shaping them into furniture and inlay pieces for temple statues, their saws and chisels working steadily on the dark wood. Ivory tusks went to carvers who produced small boxes, combs, and decorative handles, while leopard skins were cleaned and prepared for use as priestly garments or floor coverings in the royal apartments. The gold dust entered the treasury under tight security, weighed out in Theban units, and recorded for future temple gilding projects. Hatshepsut directed the integration of these goods into the kingdom's religious and administrative systems. She ordered the myrrh and frankincense stored in sealed jars within the Karnak temple magazines, with daily allotments set aside for the regular offerings to Ammon. Priests tested small amounts in the sanctuary to confirm the quality, noting the clean burn and strong aroma that surpassed what had been available through overland trade. The live trees planted at Deir el-Bahari became a focal point of the temple gardens. Gardeners tended them with extra water from the Nile and reported steady growth in the following months. Hatshepsut visited the site soon after planting, walking among the young trees and observing how their leaves caught the afternoon light against the white limestone terraces. The exotic animals drew particular attention from the palace household and the wider court. The baboons and monkeys received enclosures near the gardens, where children from noble families sometimes watched them through the bars, fascinated by their quick movements and loud calls. The greyhounds from Punt joined the royal kennels, where trainers assessed their speed and temperament for possible use in hunting parties. These animals served as living proof of the expedition's success and became part of the daily scene around the palace, their keepers reporting on feeding and health to Hatshepsut during her afternoon reviews. Public celebration followed the safe return. Hatshepsut ordered extra distributions of grain and beer throughout Thebes and the surrounding villages, with additional portions sent upstream and downstream to acknowledge the support of the gnomes that had supplied crews and provisions. During the next major festival at Karnak, the expedition received formal recognition in the temple courtyard. Nehesie and the senior officers stood before the assembled court and priesthood, while Hatshepsut presented them with gold collars and linen bolts as rewards. The high priest recited thanks to Ammon and Hathor for guiding the ships, and the crowd responded with rhythmic clapping and shouts of approval. The young Thutmose III and Neferu attended the ceremony, standing quietly beside their mother as the honours were given. The wealth from Punt strengthened several areas of the kingdom. Temple storerooms now held larger reserves of incense, allowing priests to increase the frequency and scale of offerings without concern for depletion. Gold from the expedition funded additional gilding on statues and reliefs at Deir el-Bahari, where artisans applied thin sheets to the faces and regalia of the carved figures. Ebony and ivory appeared in new furniture for the royal apartments and in decorative elements for the young king's training equipment. The influx supported the ongoing construction projects without requiring cuts to other budgets, and the treasurer adjusted his monthly reports to reflect the added resources. Hatshepsut incorporated the voyage into the permanent record at Deir el-Bahari. She commissioned a long series of reliefs for the middle terrace colonnade, directing the sculptors to depict every stage: the preparation of the ships, the loading of trade goods, the arrival in Punt with its distinctive round huts and long-haired chiefs, the weighing of incense, and the loading of trees and animals for the return. The scenes followed a clear sequence, with captions in hieroglyphs explaining the purpose and the divine favour that made the journey possible. She reviewed the progress during regular site visits, ensuring the figures matched the descriptions in Nehesie's log, and that the Punt people appeared with accurate details: tall feathers in their hair, leopard skin kilts, and offerings of cattle and ostrich eggs. The expedition's success influenced court and noble circles. Officials who had contributed ships or supplies received quiet acknowledgements in the form of small land grants or additional titles. Families whose sons had sailed returned with stories of distant shores, passed along in household gatherings and marketplace conversations. The prestige of the voyage spread beyond Thebes, reaching governors in the Delta and Upper Egypt who sent letters of congratulations and requests for shares of the new incense for their local temples. Hatshepsut replied to each with standard phrases of thanks, reinforcing the sense that the achievement belonged to the entire kingdom. Daily routines in the palace adjusted to the new goods in small ways. Servants burned Punt frankincense in the private shrines, its scent drifting through the corridors during evening hours. Cooks experimented with small amounts of exotic spices that had come as minor additions to the cargo, adding them to stews for the royal table. Hatshepsut continued her evening garden walks, now pausing to check the myrrh tree's progress and noting the first signs of new growth. The animals in their enclosures became a familiar sight, with the monkeys' calls echoing across the courtyards at dawn. The return strengthened religious life across Egypt. Temples in Memphis, Heliopolis, and smaller centres received shipments of incense, allowing priests there to perform fuller rituals. The increased availability of myrrh supported the preparation of mummification resins, benefiting both royal and noble burials. Hatshepsut ensured that records of the expedition were copied and deposited in temple archives, so future generations would know the details of the voyage and its benefits. As months passed, the myrrh trees took root and began to thrive in the protected temple gardens. Gardeners reported steady leaf growth and the first small resin droplets forming on the bark. Hatshepsut observed these developments during her visits, satisfied that the living cargo had adapted to Egyptian soil. The expedition's cargo had not only enriched the treasury, but had brought a piece of Punt permanently into the landscape of Thebes. The triumphant return marked a high point in the reign. Wealth flowed more freely into temples and workshops. Prestige grew among the court and the people, and the kingdom's reach extended visibly across the Red Sea. Hatshepsut's direction of the voyage, from planning through execution to integration of the results, demonstrated the administrative and religious systems she had built. The Nile continued its cycles, but now the river carried news of a journey completed and riches secured, adding another layer to the steady prosperity of Egypt under her rule: devotion to Amun and gods. The return of the Punt expedition brought an immediate increase in the quantity and quality of materials available for religious use. and Hatshepsut directed their application towards strengthening the kingdom's ties to the divine order. Myrrh and frankincense from the cargo filled the temple magazines at Karnak to levels not seen in generations, allowing priests to maintain daily offerings without rationing and to prepare larger quantities for major festivals. She reviewed the storage reports each week, confirming that the resins remained sealed in cool rooms to preserve their potency, and approved the transfer of daily allotments to the altars so that the scent of fresh incense rose steadily from the sanctuary throughout the day. Her personal participation in rituals deepened during this period. Each morning after the first light reached the palace, she crossed to Karnak in a small barge accompanied by a limited retinue. There she entered the inner areas reserved for the king, where she performed the standard sequence of offerings, pouring water over the statue of Ammon, placing bread and beer on the altar, burning incense, and reciting the fixed formulas that acknowledged the god as the creator who sustained Mart. Priests assisted by handing her the necessary items, small gold dishes for libations, fresh lotus flowers for placement at the god's feet, and she executed each step with the same deliberate pace she applied to administrative reviews. These daily visits became a fixed part of her schedule, reinforcing her role as the intermediary between the human and divine realms. Temple dedications expanded under her oversight. She commissioned additional chapels within the Karnak precinct, including one for Amun's consort Mut and another for their son Khonsu, using stone from the Aswan quarries and cedar from the Punt shipments for the roof beams. During the dedication ceremonies, she led the processions herself, walking ahead of the sacred bark while priests chanted and musicians played sistra and harps. The new structures received endowments of land and personnel drawn from her own estates, ensuring that priests and offering bearers had permanent support. She inspected the finished chapels after completion, checking the alignment of columns and the clarity of carved inscriptions that recorded her titles, and the divine approval granted at coronation. Festivals grew in scale and frequency as resources allowed. The Opet celebration, when Amun's statue travelled from Karnak to the Luxor temple, now included longer processions with additional stops at temporary shrines along the route. Hatshepsut appeared in full regalia at the head of the line, carrying the crook and flail, while Neferur and Thutmose III followed in litters. The festival extended over several days with public feasts where extra grain and beer from the treasury fed large crowds gathered on the east bank. During the beautiful festival of the valley, when the gods crossed to the west bank to visit the mortuary temples, Deir el-Bahri became a central focus. The myrrh trees from Punt, now established in the gardens, provided branches for garlands that decorated the bark, and the scent of their resin mixed with the traditional incense during the rites. Her devotion extended to other major deities beyond the Theban triad. At Abydos she ordered repairs to the Temple of Osiris, sending teams of masons to restore damaged reliefs and add new offering scenes that included her name. She visited the site once to oversee the work, walking the processional way and noting how the restored walls aligned with the older structures. Similar attention went to the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, where she directed the addition of a small chapel using limestone blocks transported by barge. These projects, though smaller than those at Karnak, received the same careful review of plans and progress reports, ensuring that every temple under royal patronage maintained its function in the cosmic balance. Priests across Egypt responded to her consistent support with increased cooperation. The high priest of Amun at Karnak met with her regularly to discuss endowment adjustments and staff appointments, and she approved promotions based on service records rather than family connections alone. In return, the priesthood maintained precise records of offerings and festivals, sending monthly summaries to the palace for her examination. This mutual arrangement strengthened the religious administration, with temples functioning as stable centres of ritual that in turn supported the legitimacy of her rule. Public devotion reflected these changes in everyday ways. In Thebes, families gathered at small household shrines each evening to burn small amounts of punt incense, a practice that had become more common since the expedition's return. Market vendors sold faience amulets and scarabs inscribed with protective spells, and craftsmen produced more statues of the gods for private use. Along the Nile in other nomes, local priests reported higher attendance at festivals because of the extra offerings supplied from the central treasury. Hatshepsut noted these trends in reports from provincial governors and adjusted allocations accordingly, directing modest shipments of incense to temples in Memphis and Heliopolis so that the benefits reached beyond the Theban region. Her inner commitment to the gods appeared in private habits as well. In the palace apartments, she maintained a small shrine room with statues of Amun, Mut, Khonsu, and Hathor, where she placed daily offerings of bread, beer, and flowers gathered from the gardens. She performed these rites herself before the first public audience, reciting the short formulas in a low voice while servants waited outside the door. These moments provided a quiet counterpoint to the administrative duties, allowing her to reaffirm the connection between her actions and divine order. Thutmose III and Neferua participated more actively in religious life as they grew older. Thutmose III joined her at Karnak for selected morning offerings, learning the correct way to hold the incense burner and pour libations under priestly guidance. Neferua took part in festivals dedicated to Hathor, carrying small sistra and observing the dance sequences performed by temple musicians. Hatshepsut ensured that both children received instruction in the religious calendar, explaining the significance of each festival and the role of the king in maintaining cosmic harmony. Their involvement helped prepare them for future responsibilities while reinforcing the family's central place in the kingdom's spiritual life. The increased availability of incense supported the preparation of sacred oils, and resins used in temple rituals and royal burials. Priests at the House of Life compounded these materials according to traditional recipes, and Hatshepsut reviewed samples during visits to Karnak to confirm the quality. The resins from Punt proved particularly effective in producing the aromatic blends needed for anointing statues and preparing mummification materials, benefiting both living worship and the care of the dead. Court nobles and officials incorporated greater religious observance into their own routines. Many added small chapels to their estates or increased their personal offerings at local temples, following the example set by the palace. Hatshepsut acknowledged these efforts indirectly through appointments and land grants, encouraging the spread of devotion without formal decrees. The result was a broader network of religious activity that supported the central temples and contributed to the kingdom's overall stability. During the inundation season, when work slowed in the fields, Hatshepsut directed additional resources to temple maintenance. Crews repaired mud brick walls damaged by rising water and cleared silt from processional ways. She visited affected sites by boat, checking the progress and approving extra labour when needed. These seasonal adjustments kept the temples functional year-round and demonstrated her attention to detail in matters of divine service. As the years passed, her role as divine intermediary became more visible in inscriptions and reliefs. At Deir el-Bahri, the completed walls showed her offering directly to Amun in scenes that mirrored the daily rites she performed. Similar depictions appeared at Karnak and smaller temples, with captions recording the specific goods she had dedicated: myrrh from Punt, gold from Nubia, linen from her estates. These records served as a permanent statement of her devotion, visible to priests, officials, and visitors who passed through the sacred spaces. The priesthood's influence extended into administrative matters through her support. Temple scribes assisted with recording endowments and festival accounts, and she consulted them on questions of ritual timing or divine omens. This collaboration ensured that religious and governmental functions remained aligned, with each supporting the other in maintaining Ma'at across the two lands. Hatshepsut's devotion to the gods shaped the rhythm of her reign. Daily offerings, festival leadership, temple construction, and resource allocation all flowed from the same steady commitment to divine order. The Punt goods had provided the means to elevate these practices, but the underlying structure came from years of consistent oversight. Temples across Egypt stood better supplied and better maintained. Priests performed their duties with greater confidence, and the people participated in a religious life that felt directly connected to the palace. The Nile carried boats laden with offerings as reliably as it carried grain, and the gods received their due in every season under her watchful direction. As Thutmose III grew into his teenage years, the formal arrangement of co-rule took on more practical substance, while Hatshepsut continued to direct the central administration. The young king, now training regularly in military skills, began to appear alongside her in selected audiences and temple ceremonies. Each morning the vizier and senior officials presented their reports in the main audience hall, addressing both rulers seated on raised thrones, Hatshepsut on the left, in her full pharaonic regalia, Thutmose III on the right in a shorter kilt and simple crown. She handled the administrative and religious portions of the agenda, reviewing grain distributions, temple endowments, and provincial tax summaries, while he listened closely and occasionally asked questions about border patrols or chariot maintenance. The division allowed her to maintain oversight of the daily machinery of state, while he gained gradual exposure to governance. Thutmose III's military education progressed under experienced commanders who had served during the earlier reigns. He spent mornings in the training fields near the palace, practicing archery with full-size bows, driving light chariots pulled by matched pairs of horses, and studying formations with small groups of soldiers. Hatshepsut allocated resources for this training: bronze arrowheads from the treasury, cedar wood chariots repaired in the workshops, and additional horses brought from the Levant through regular trade. She reviewed the instructor's reports each week, noting his progress in accuracy and endurance, and approved increases in practice ammunition when the reports showed steady improvement. These sessions remained separate from her own duties, though she sometimes observed from a shaded platform at the field's edge, watching the dust rise under chariot wheels and the precise release of arrows towards straw targets. Joint appearances increased during religious festivals and public events. At the Opet festival, the two rulers walked together at the head of the procession, Hatshepsut carrying the crook and flail, while Thutmose III held a small staff and followed the steps she had taught him years earlier. During the beautiful festival of the valley, they crossed the Nile in separate barges, but met at Deir el-Bahri, where they offered together at the sanctuary altars. The reliefs carved on temple walls during these years showed them side by side in many scenes, Hatshepsut performing the primary rites, while Thutmose III stood in attendance, creating a visual record of shared authority that priests and visitors saw every day. She directed the placement of these images herself during site inspections, ensuring the proportions and captions followed established patterns. Court dynamics adjusted to the emerging partnership. Officials addressed both rulers in formal reports, though most detailed administrative matters continued to go first to Hatshepsut for decision. The vizier coordinated between them, presenting military updates to Thutmose III and civilian ones to her, then combining the outcomes into unified decrees sealed with both cartouches. Nobles from the nomes sent gifts and reports to both, with some addressing letters specifically to the young king on matters of border security or hunting rights. Hatshepsut encouraged these communications by replying promptly and including small acknowledgements from Thutmose III when appropriate, helping him build his own network of contacts without disrupting the established flow of authority. Daily life in the palace reflected the gradual shift. Meals in the main hall now seated both rulers at the head table, with Neferua joining when her schedule allowed. Conversation during these times stayed practical updates on the latest harvest tallies, news from Nubian forts, or plans for upcoming festivals. Thutmose III described his training exercises in straightforward terms, mentioning the weight of a new bow or the handling of a chariot team, while Hatshepsut shared observations from her morning reviews of estate ledgers or temple accounts. Servants served the same range of food: grilled Nile perch, lentil stew, fresh bread, and dates, though portions for the young king included extra meat to support his physical regimen. Neferua, now in her late teens, played a supporting role in the household and court. She assisted with organising certain festival preparations, such as arranging the garlands of myrrh branches for the bark, or supervising the distribution of extra linen to temple musicians. Hatshepsut included her daughter in private discussions about administrative details, explaining how grain allocations affected temple staffing, or how tribute from Punt continued to supply incense years after the voyage. Neferu's presence helped maintain continuity in the women's quarters, where she oversaw the daily routines of maids and nurses, ensuring the palace household ran smoothly, even as attention turned more toward the young king's development. Hatshepsut's inner focus during these co-ruling years remained on balance and preparation. She kept her personal ostraca records up to date, noting Thutmose III's progress in military skills alongside summaries of administrative decisions she had made. She worried quietly about the timing of his full independence, considering how best to transfer certain responsibilities without creating gaps in oversight. These thoughts stayed private, channeled into careful planning rather than open discussion, and she adjusted his training schedule or resource allocations in small increments to match his growing competence. Military matters began to occupy more of Thutmose III's time as he reached his late teens. He joined selected patrols along the Nubian border, travelling south by barge with a small escort to inspect forts and meet with local commanders. Hatshepsut approved each trip after reviewing the itinerary and supply lists, ensuring the young king carried protective amulets, and that messengers reported back regularly on his safety and observations. These journeys gave him direct experience of the southern territories, their garrisons, and the tribute routes that supplied gold and cattle. Upon return, he presented brief reports in the audience hall, describing fort conditions or the state of irrigation channels, and she listened while making notes for later follow-up. Administrative cooperation continued without friction. When provincial governors sent reports on flood damage or canal repairs, Hatshepsut handled the initial review and resource allocation, then informed Thutmose III of the decisions, so he remained informed on matters affecting military supply lines. The treasurer presented combined accounts that showed both rulers' cartouches, and she signed off on distributions while he observed the process. This shared exposure ensured that the kingdom's finances and logistics remained transparent to both, building a foundation for eventual transition. Religious leadership stayed primarily with Hatshepsut, though Thutmose III joined her in major rites. He learned to perform the offering sequence at Karnak under her guidance, holding the incense burner at the correct height and reciting the responses in rhythm with the priests. During smaller daily ceremonies in the palace shrine, she allowed him to take the lead on occasion, stepping back to observe his execution of the formulas. These moments reinforced the continuity of royal duty, while allowing him to practice the role he would one day hold alone. The court atmosphere remained stable, with officials moving between the two rulers as needed. Some, particularly those with long service in administration, continued to report primarily to Hatshepsut, while younger commanders gravitated toward Thutmose III for military discussions. She encouraged this natural division by directing certain matters to him directly and praising his handling of them in private conversations. Nobles adjusted their approaches accordingly, sending separate letters when the subject fit one ruler's primary area or joint messages for broader issues. As Thutmose III approached his early 20s, his participation in state decisions increased. He began to suggest minor adjustments to patrol schedules or training routines, which Hatshepsut reviewed and incorporated when they aligned with overall needs. She maintained final approval on major allocations, grain for forts, timber for chariots, but allowed him increasing latitude in operational details. This gradual handover preserved the smooth operation of government while preparing him for independent rule. The Nile's cycles continued to frame the kingdom's rhythm. During inundation months, when travel slowed, Hatshepsut and Thutmose III used the quieter period for extended planning sessions on border fortifications and temple endowments. In the planting and harvest seasons, reports on crop yields reached them jointly, and they coordinated distributions to temples and garrisons. The partnership functioned through these practical routines, with each ruler contributing according to their strengths, her in administration and religion, him in military readiness. Neferu's role remained steady in the background. She managed aspects of the household that supported both rulers overseeing linen supplies for court garments, coordinating festival preparations, and maintaining the gardens where myrrh trees from Punt still grew. Her quiet competence allowed Hatshepsut to focus on governance without concern for domestic details. By the later years of this co-ruling phase, the arrangement had settled into a functional balance. Thutmose III commanded respect among the military and began to take on more visible leadership in selected areas, while Hatshepsut retained central control over the administrative and religious core of the state. The court operated with the same orderly efficiency that had defined the reign from its beginning, now sustained by two rulers working in tandem. Reports arrived each morning, temples received their offerings, borders remained secure, and the dynasty moved forward under shared authority that prepared for the eventual shift to sole rule by the young king. Years of peace and wealth. The steady partnership between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III created a long stretch of internal peace that allowed the benefits of good governance to reach far beyond the palace walls. Decisions made in Thebes about grain storage, canal maintenance, and fair tax collection translated into more reliable harvests and steadier lives for farming families along the Nile. The years became known among the people for their consistency rather than dramatic events. Flood levels stayed within expected ranges, and the systems of reservoirs and channels built over previous rains functioned without major breakdowns. Farmers in the villages woke each morning to fields that yielded enough emmer, wheat, and barley to feed their households, and still leave surplus for tax payments. In the small villages scattered across the floodplains, life followed an ancient rhythm made more secure by the palace's attention to irrigation. During the inundation season, when the Nile spread its waters across the land, families watched the level markers on local nilometers with less anxiety than in earlier times. The water deposited rich silt as usual, but the extra grain stored in state granaries meant that even if one field flooded too heavily, assistance could arrive from central supplies. Men and women worked together planting seeds once the waters receded, using wooden ploughs pulled by oxen and copper-tipped tools supplied through local officials. Children helped by carrying water jars or scaring birds from the young shoots. The knowledge that temple and palace officials monitored flood patterns allowed families to plan their planting with greater confidence. Harvest time brought visible improvements to village life. Families gathered larger crops of wheat and barley, along with lentils, onions, cucumbers, and melons. Part of each harvest went to the local tax collectors in measured baskets, but the remainder stayed with the households. Women ground grain into flour using stone querns and baked fresh bread in outdoor ovens every morning. Beer brewing became more consistent because surplus barley was available, and households could produce enough thick beer to last through the dry months. Fish from the Nile remained a daily staple, caught in reed traps or purchased from fishermen who travelled the river with their catches. The extra stability meant fewer periods of scarcity, and children grew up with more regular meals of bread, vegetables, and occasional meat from goats or ducks raised in village yards. Trade routes strengthened during these years, bringing goods from distant regions into local marketplaces. Ships arriving from the north carried olive oil and cedar wood, while southern boats delivered gold, ivory, and the last remaining myrrh from the Punt expedition. Merchants in towns along the river set up stalls with a wider variety of items than before. Common people could trade their surplus vegetables or linen for small luxuries, coloured beads from the workshops, better quality copper needles, or jars of honey. In the larger market squares near Thebes, vendors sold dates from the oasis regions, dried fish from the delta, and linen cloth woven in village homes. The increased flow of goods meant that even modest families could occasionally acquire a new cooking pot or a stronger basket for carrying grain. Craftsmen in Thebes and other centres benefited from the steady demand created by temple, projects, and palace needs. Stonemasons who had worked on Deir el-Bahari found continued employment repairing smaller shrines or carving statues for local temples. Carpenters shaped ebony wood from punt into furniture and boxes, while potters produced larger numbers of storage jars using improved clay techniques. Weavers in household workshops turned out finer linen because the flax harvests were reliable. These workers received regular payments in grain and oil, allowing them to maintain their families without the uncertainty that had marked earlier periods. Many taught their skills to sons and daughters, passing on the trades that supported the kingdom's prosperity. Housing in both villages and towns showed gradual improvements. Farmers repaired mud brick walls more frequently because they had surplus labour and materials. Some added extra rooms, or raised the height of their homes to protect against unusually high floods. In Thebes, workers near the temple precincts built slightly larger houses with better ventilation and small courtyards. Roofs received thicker layers of palm thatch, and doorways were fitted with stronger wooden frames. Inside these homes, families placed simple furniture, low stools, reed mats, and storage chests made from local wood. The scent of fresh bread and simmering lentil stew filled the evenings, and small shrines in the corners held amulets and small statues of household gods like Bez and Tauret. Clothing remained practical but became more varied in quality. Men working in the fields wore short kilts of sturdy linen, while women dressed in simple sheath dresses that reached the ankles. Because flax production stayed high, replacements came more regularly, and many families owned at least one better garment for festival days. Children went barefoot most of the time, but received small leather sandals for longer walks to market or temple. Jewellery stayed modest strings of faience beads or simple copper rings, but the steady economy meant that more people could afford protective amulets carved with spells for health and safe childbirth. Festivals provided the main opportunities for common people to feel connected to the larger kingdom. During the Opet festival, families travelled to Thebes from nearby villages to watch the procession and receive shares of the extra bread and beer distributed from temple stores. The scent of punt incense drifted through the streets, and musicians played harps and flutes late into the evening. Similar gatherings occurred at the beautiful Festival of the Valley, when people crossed the river to visit ancestors' tombs and watch the sacred bark rest at Deir el-Bahri. These events offered days of rest from field work and a chance to see the rulers in person, reinforcing the sense that the palace cared for the welfare of the entire land. The building projects that continued under Hatshepsut created steady employment for thousands of men across the country. Labourers rotated between temple construction and farm work according to the seasons, earning grain rations that supplemented their family harvests. Their wages supported local economies, bakers sold more bread, brewers produced more beer, and sandal makers had steady customers. When the major phases at Deir el-Bahri finished, many workers returned to their villages with new skills in stone handling and organisation that they applied to local irrigation projects. This movement of labour kept villages connected to the capital without draining the countryside of its essential farmers. Stability extended to matters of security. Border patrols in Nubia and the north prevented major incursions, allowing traders to move goods safely along the river and desert routes. Villages near the frontiers reported fewer disturbances, and families could plant their fields without fear of sudden raids. The consistent presence of Egyptian garrisons reassured communities that had lived through more uncertain times in previous generations. Messengers travelling between nomes carried not only official reports but also news of good harvests and successful festivals, spreading a general sense of well-being across the land. Hatshepsut's attention to detail in administration reached ordinary lives through the officials who visited villages each year. Scribes recorded crop estimates and adjusted tax demands according to actual yields rather than fixed quotas. When a region suffered from poor flooding, relief grain arrived from central stores with instructions for fair distribution. These systems, maintained through years of careful oversight, prevented the extreme shortages that had occasionally struck in the past. Families learned to trust that the kingdom would support them during difficult seasons, which encouraged them to invest effort in maintaining canals and storing their own small surpluses. Daily routines in the villages reflected this new sense of security. Women woke early to grind grain and prepare meals, while men headed to the fields with tools over their shoulders. Children helped with chores and attended informal lessons from local scribes who taught basic counting and simple religious prayers. Evenings brought families together around small fires where stories of past pharaohs mixed with accounts of the current rulers. The presence of punt incense in many households added a special note to evening prayers, and the myrrh trees growing at Deir el-Bahri became a topic of conversation when travellers returned from Thebes. the prosperity of these years showed most clearly in the health and growth of the population. Children survived infancy in greater numbers because food supplies remained steady and medical knowledge from temple physicians spread to local healers. Villages expanded slowly as new mud brick homes appeared on higher ground. Markets bustled with more activity, and the river carried increased traffic of trading boats and passenger ferries. The combination of good harvests, active trade, and stable governance created a period remembered by later generations as one of unusual calm and plenty. Craftsmen and merchants in larger towns experienced similar benefits. Potters produced finer wares for both local use and export, while metalworkers shaped copper tools that lasted longer in the fields. Fishermen on the Nile caught and sold more perch and tilapia because demand stayed high in the markets. These occupations supported growing families and allowed some workers to save small amounts of grain or cloth for future needs. The steady economy reduced the desperation that had once driven people to seek work far from home. Hatshepsut and Thutmose III appeared together at major public events, and their joint presence reassured the people that the dynasty remained strong. Common Egyptians saw the rulers during festival processions and heard their names spoken in temple prayers. The knowledge that the palace managed resources carefully gave ordinary families confidence in the future. Decisions about granary reserves, canal repairs, and fair taxation filtered down through layers of officials until they affected the daily lives of farmers, weavers, and fishermen along the entire length of the Nile. The years of peace and wealth under their co-rule created a foundation that would be remembered long after. Villages stayed productive, markets stayed active, and the people experienced a level of stability that allowed daily life to proceed with quiet predictability. The river flowed, the fields produced, and the temples received their offerings, all supported by the careful governance that reached from the palace in Thebes to the smallest farming community. These were years when ordinary Egyptians could focus on their work, their families, and their traditions, without the shadow of uncertainty that had marked other periods in the kingdom's history. 17. Final years and health. The later years of Hatshepsut's reign settled into a quieter pattern as the major building projects reached completion and the kingdom continued to enjoy the fruits of sustained peace. Thutmose III had by now taken on a larger share of military oversight and border inspections, travelling south to Nubia several times each year to review garrison conditions and tribute collections. Hatshepsut remained in Thebes for most of these periods, directing the central administration from her reception room with the same methodical review of daily reports. Grain tallies, temple offering schedules, and provincial tax summaries arrived each morning by messenger boat, and she marked adjustments or approvals before passing the documents to the vizier for execution. The routine had become so familiar that scribes anticipated her questions about discrepancies in numbers or delays in deliveries, preparing extra details in advance. Her health began to show the first noticeable signs of age during this time. Mornings started with stiffness in the joints that required longer periods of gentle movement before the day's activities could begin. Servants brought warm oil infused with myrrh for daily massages, focusing on the shoulders, knees, and lower back where the discomfort concentrated. She continued the short barge crossings to Karnak for morning offerings, but reduced the frequency slightly, delegating some of the routine rites to trusted priests while still attending the major festival processions. The physicians from the House of Life visited regularly, preparing herbal mixtures of willow bark and honey to ease inflammation, and recommending rest periods in the shaded garden courtyards during the hottest hours. Daily life adjusted around these changes without disrupting the palace. Rhythm. Hatshepsut held audiences from a cushioned chair rather than standing for long periods, and scribes moved their low tables closer so she could review papyrus rolls without strain. Meals remained simple: fresh bread, grilled fish seasoned with coriander, lentils stewed with onions, and dates for sweetness. But the kitchen staff added more soft-cooked vegetables and bone broths recommended by the physicians. She ate smaller portions more slowly, and servants placed extra pillows behind her back during the sessions. Nephria, now a young woman managing much of the household organization, ensured that the women's quarters supplied the necessary oils and linens for comfort. Thutmose III returned from his southern journeys with detailed accounts of fort repairs, soldier morale, and the steady flow of gold and cattle tribute. He presented these reports in the audience hall with growing assurance, describing specific improvements to water channels or the placement of new watchtowers. Hatshepsut listened while seated, asking clarifying questions about supply lines and garrison numbers, then approving resource allocations from the central treasury. Their discussions stayed focused on practical outcomes, how many additional bronze tools the forts needed, or whether extra grain should be sent upstream during the dry season. The young king's increasing competence allowed her to delegate more of the military correspondence to him, though she continued to review the final decrees before they went out under both cartouches. Court officials adapted to her reduced mobility with quiet efficiency. The vizier conducted preliminary meetings in an antechamber near her apartments, so she could join only for final decisions. Messengers delivered reports directly to her reception room, rather than requiring her to walk to the main audience hall every day. The high priest of Amun visited more frequently to report on temple affairs, bringing small portable altars so she could perform simplified versions of the daily offerings when full ceremonies proved too taxing. These adjustments kept the flow of governance uninterrupted while allowing her to conserve energy for the essential tasks. Neferur took on additional responsibilities in the palace and at court. She coordinated festival preparations, oversaw the distribution of linen and incense to temple staff, and managed the gardens where the myrrh trees from Punt still flourished. During Hatshepsut's quieter afternoons, Neferur sat with her mother, reviewing household accounts or discussing the education of younger noble children who served in the palace. These conversations covered practical matters, how to train new maids in proper linen folding, or which families could supply reliable wet nurses for royal grandchildren if the need arose. Neferur's steady presence provided continuity in the women's quarters and allowed Hatshepsut to maintain oversight without constant physical effort. The palace staff noticed the changes but maintained their routines with practiced discretion. Servants moved more slowly when assisting her from chair to litter, and gardeners placed extra benches along the shaded paths so she could rest during short walks. The scent of myrrh oil became more prominent in her apartments, used both for medicinal rubs and for burning in the small shrine room, where she continued private prayers each evening. The physicians adjusted their treatments over time, adding poultices of heated barley and occasional steam baths, scented with lotus to ease breathing and joint pain. Thutmose III's growing role became more visible during this period. He led military exercises in the training fields and conducted inspections of the Theban garrisons, reporting back on equipment readiness and troop training. Hatshepsut reviewed his summaries alongside her own administrative notes, occasionally suggesting adjustments to supply schedules or the rotation of officers. Their joint audiences continued, though she participated from her seated position while he stood or moved between the vizier and the military commanders. The arrangement preserved the appearance of shared rule, while allowing her to conserve strength for the decisions that required her judgment. Religious observances remained central despite the physical limitations. Hatshepsut attended the major festivals seated in a shaded pavilion near the processional route, watching the sacred bark pass and listening to the chants. She continued to dedicate small offerings at Karnak through intermediaries, ensuring that her name appeared in the records of daily rites. Priests reported on the condition of the temples and the growth of the myrrh trees, and she approved continued endowments from the treasury to maintain the flow of goods. These acts, though less physically demanding, kept her connected to the divine order that had guided her reign from the beginning. The kingdom itself showed no signs of strain from her reduced activity. Tribute continued to arrive from Nubia and the Levant, granaries stayed full, and trade boats moved steadily along the Nile. Provincial governors sent the same regular reports on crop conditions and canal maintenance, and Hatshepsut reviewed them with the same attention to detail. The administrative systems she had strengthened over decades functioned reliably under the vizier's coordination. With Thutmose III assuming more of the fieldwork while she handled the central planning, personal reflections surfaced in quiet moments. During the evening hours when lamps burned low, she sometimes sat alone in the garden courtyard, listening to the river sounds and the distant calls of night birds. She reviewed her ostraca notes one last time each day, adding brief entries about the young king's latest report or a new adjustment to temple staffing. These records, kept in the same wooden chest for years, now served as a private chronicle of the reign's closing phase. Concerns about the succession remained measured. She trusted Thutmose III's preparation, but continued to monitor the balance between military and administrative authority. Health fluctuations came and went. Some days allowed longer walks in the gardens or fuller participation in audiences. Others required extended rest with only essential visitors admitted. The physicians adjusted their prescriptions accordingly, increasing the use of soothing herbs and warm compresses. Servants kept the apartments cooler with wet linen hangings and fans, and the kitchen prepared lighter meals of broth and fruit when appetite diminished. As the years advanced, Hatshepsut spent more time in her private quarters surrounded by familiar faces. Neferua managed the daily household, Thutmose III handled military matters, and trusted officials kept the state running smoothly. The palace gardens still bloomed with the myrrh trees, their resin scent drifting on the breeze, and the Nile flowed past Thebes with its unchanging rhythm. The kingdom prospered under the systems she had built, and the dynasty prepared for the inevitable transition while she maintained her steady oversight from the centre of power. The final months of Hatshepsut's life unfolded in the palace at Thebes with the same measured pace that had defined her years of rule. By 1458 BCE, she had reached approximately 50 years of age, and the gradual decline in her health became evident to the small circle of physicians and attendants who managed her daily care. The joint stiffness that had started in her later regency years now restricted longer walks through the gardens, and breathing grew more laboured during the warmer months. Servants prepared the apartments with extra cushions on the low chairs, and kept bowls of cool water scented with lotus nearby for her comfort. The physicians from the House of Life adjusted their treatments week by week, using poultices of heated barley mixed with willow bark and small doses of opium syrup to ease discomfort without clouding her mind. She continued to review the most important state reports each morning, seated in her reception room with the vizier and a single scribe present, marking approvals on grain distributions and temple endowments even when her voice had grown quieter. Thutmose III returned from his latest inspection tour in Nubia to find the palace staff moving with subdued efficiency. He took over the daily military briefings completely, reporting to her in short afternoon sessions about fort repairs and tribute tallies. She listened from her chair, asking occasional questions about water supplies for the southern garrisons or the condition of the chariot teams, then nodded approval for the necessary allocations. Neferua remained constantly nearby, overseeing the household servants and ensuring that fresh linens and light meals arrived at regular intervals. The two children, now fully grown adults in their roles, coordinated the flow of visitors so that only essential officials entered the private quarters. The court maintained its outward routines, temple offerings continued on schedule, messengers arrived from the gnomes with harvest updates, and the Nile boats kept delivering cedar and gold. But inside the royal apartments, the atmosphere shifted toward quiet preparation. The end came gradually over several weeks. Hatshepsut's strength ebbed until she spent most hours resting on the raised bed platform in her sleeping chamber, surrounded by the familiar scents of myrrh oil and the faint river breeze that drifted through the high windows. Priests from Karnak visited daily to perform simplified rites at her bedside, reciting the standard protective formulas and placing small amulets of bez and taret on the linen sheets. She spoke little in the final days, but when she did, her words concerned practical matters, confirming that the myrrh trees at Deir el-Bahri still received water, and that the latest punt incense reserves had been divided correctly among the temples. Thutmose III sat with her each evening, describing the day's events in the audience hall and the progress of border patrols, and she offered brief guidance on resource distribution before resting again. Neferu stayed through the nights, changing the cool cloths on her forehead and adjusting the light hangings to block the harshest sun. When the physicians recognized that the end was near, the palace entered a period of formal readiness. Embalmers from the West Bank workshops arrived with their equipment and began the traditional preparations in an outer chamber once she had passed quietly in her sleep, around 1458 BCE. The body was taken across the river under cover of night, accompanied by a small procession of priests carrying torches and chanting the opening spells of the Book of the Dead. The 70-day embalming process followed the established sequence. The body was purified with natron salts, the internal organs removed and placed in canopic jars carved with her cartouches, and the remains wrapped in hundreds of yards of the finest linen from her own estates. Amulets of gold, faience, and lapis lazuli were placed between the layers according to the positions prescribed by the priest's scarabs over the heart, eye amulets on the forehead, and small figures of the four sons of Horus beside the limbs. Thutmose III oversaw the selection of the burial goods, choosing items from the palace stores that reflected her reign. A set of golden fly whisks, ivory boxes inlaid with ebony from Punt, and jars of the finest myrrh resin. Burial arrangements had been planned years earlier in the Valley of the Kings. Hatshepsut's tomb, designated KV-20, had been cut deep into the rock with a long descending corridor and a burial chamber large enough for her sarcophagus and the canopic equipment. The sarcophagus itself, carved from red quartzite, bore her full royal titles and scenes of her offering to Ammon and Osiris. Workmen from the royal necropolis village completed the final sealing of the entrance after the funeral procession arrived. The cortege moved along the west bank path at dawn, with Thutmose III walking at the head carrying a small bouquet of myrrh branches from the temple gardens. Priests recited the full sequence of transformation spells while the body was lowered into the chamber. The tomb was then sealed with plaster and stamped with the royal necropolis seal, and guards took up their posts to ensure its protection. News of her passing spread along the Nile by fast messenger boats within days. Provincial governors received formal announcements and organised local periods of mourning, with temples dimming their lamps and reducing public offerings for the required interval. In Thebes itself, the streets quieted for the mourning period, with families gathering in their homes to burn small amounts of frankincense in memory of the ruler who had brought the Punt trees and the long years of steady prosperity. Market vendors closed their stalls for the first week, and craftsmen set aside their tools while the palace distributed extra grain and beer to ensure no household went without during the observance. The court officials gathered in the audience hall under Thutmose III's leadership to swear renewed loyalty and to confirm that all administrative systems would continue without interruption. The immediate response from the people showed the depth of the stability she had created. No unrest followed the announcement, and daily life resumed its patterns once the mourning period ended. Farmers returned to their fields, noting the same reliable canal water and the same tax collectors who had served under her. Temples maintained their offering schedules using the reserves she had built, and the workshops at Karnak and Deir el-Bahri continued carving new reliefs that now included scenes of Thutmose III alone, but referenced the earlier joint rule in their inscriptions. Neferu remained in the palace to assist with the household transition, ensuring that the women's quarters and gardens continued their routines, while the new sole ruler settled into his full authority. Thutmose III directed the final arrangements for Hatshepsut's mortuary cult at Deir el-Bahri, appointing priests to perform daily offerings at her chapel there so that her memory would receive the same care she had given to earlier kings. He ordered statues of her placed in prominent positions within the temple terraces, their inscriptions recording her titles and achievements without alteration. The myrrh trees she had brought from Punt continued to grow beside the colonnades, their resin harvested each season for the very altars where her cult was maintained. These acts ensured continuity within the 18th dynasty, linking the new reign directly to the structures and systems she had strengthened over 2 decades. The court adjusted to the change with practiced order. The vizier continued presenting reports to Thutmose III alone, now using the full set of seals that had previously borne both cartouches. Military commanders received their instructions from the new king, and the priesthood at Karnak shifted their primary dedications to him, while keeping her name in the daily offering lists as a revered predecessor. Common people along the Nile noticed little immediate difference. The boats still carried grain, the market still traded linen and fish, and the festivals proceeded on the same calendar. The transition felt like the natural progression of the river itself, steady and uninterrupted. In the years that followed, Hatshepsut's legacy remained embedded in the landscape. The terraces of Deir el-Bahari stood white against the cliffs. The obelisks at Karnak cast long shadows across the temple courts, and the reliefs on countless walls showed her performing the rites that had sustained the kingdom. The administrative records she had kept so carefully formed the foundation for Thutmose III's later campaigns and building programs. The people who had lived through her reign remembered the years of reliable harvests and secure borders, passing those memories to their children in village evenings and marketplace conversations. Her burial in the Valley of the Kings, though later disturbed in antiquity, completed the cycle that had begun with her birth in the same royal city decades earlier. The 18th dynasty continued its course under Thutmose III, who expanded Egypt's influence even further while building on the prosperous base she had left. The court, the temples, and the villages along the Nile carried forward the systems of governance, devotion, and daily labour that she had refined through careful attention. Her lifetime had spanned from the quiet palace of her childhood to the full authority of Pharaoh, touching every level of Egyptian society through construction, trade, ritual, and steady administration. The kingdom she left behind stood secure, its people fed, its gods honoured, and its future firmly rooted in the order she had helped maintain. The palace grows still now as the lamps burn lower. The river outside continues its soft murmur against the stone quays, carrying the same steady current it has for centuries. In the gardens, the myrrh trees rustle faintly in the night breeze, their leaves catching the moonlight just as they did when she first saw them planted. Take a slow breath with me, feel the cool air moving through the room, the gentle hum of the fan you turned on earlier still whispering in the background. Everything that needed to be done has been done. The kingdom she guided rests peacefully in the hands of those who followed. Let your thoughts drift like the boats on the Nile, carrying no weight, only the quiet satisfaction of a long story well told. The lights in Thebes dim further, the stars hold their places above the cliffs, and the gentle rhythm of night settles over everything. Rest now.